Dragons, Searanox the Feared, Act 1, Affairs of Dragons, Part 1, Arrival. Azurea's wings folded hard against her blue-scaled body. Weaving back and forth between bush, tree, and underbrush, she received more than a couple of branch slaps on her frantic run forward. The backward curve of her horns helped protect her face as she twitched back and forth through the brush. The pair that pursued her were not as fast, but were not giving up either. When you have a great chain about your neck, you are not hard to follow. It had been well over 3 hours. They were relentless. The mountains ahead would hopefully hide her. The slender blue sky dragoness exploded from the thicket and her paws found. Ash? She cocked her head briefly, but turned her head backward on a great swivelling neck when she heard her pursuers still coming. She glanced about. It was a large clearing, littered with bones, ash, and scorched earth. To match the scene, the yawning mouth of a nearby cave told of a powerful denizen living inside the mountain itself, for it was also scattered with bones and black marks on its cusps. She could not see deep inside. It would have to do. She could hide until they passed by. She dashed forward, opening her wings so she would not leave tracks in the mounded ash and scattered remains of who knew what they once were. She landed at the lip of the cave soundlessly, her paws patting the ground as she scrambled into darkness. She didn't go deep inside. Who knew where the tunnel went, or what was down there? She could hide at the mouth of the cave until her followers left. Azurea cocked her head and waited. Her ears tucked a little and Azurea turned her head backward. Was someone growling at her? The chain rattled just a little and she grabbed at it quickly to silence it. No, it wasn't growling. It was breathing. Many creatures taught themselves to growl in their sleep to ward off predators. Something deep in that cave was sleeping, loudly. She shuddered a little, but her heart almost stopped when she turned forward again. A pair of sky dragons were on the lip of the ashy clearing, looking around curiously. It was well over 100 feet wide and 50 feet across. All of it centered on the very cave that Azurea was hiding in. Suddenly this looked like a horrible hiding spot. Whatever lived there had made a statement with the ground surrounding the entrance to its home. Stay the hell away. The armored sky dragons crossed the clearing slowly, commenting in low voices and occasionally kicking a scrap of old rabbit folk armor aside. Their voices came into earshot as they came close. For her will be punished, or worse, exiled. But this looks like the home of one of those great big... He stopped, for he'd spotted movement in the shadow of the lip of the cave, where Azurea hid. Who's there? Come out. Is that you, Azurea? He shouted, throwing his chest out in a standard regal display of power amongst male dragons. Arrogant wretches. Azurea snarled quietly, trying to stay still and be part of the cave wall. But they were having none of it. Bones crunched, armor bits groaned, and skeletons fell apart as the pair of them came closer. Come out of there and maybe we can get there in 2 days instead of 2 weeks like you seem to intend, one said. Come on, we can drag her if we have to. She has the chain on still. They started forward as a pair, and Azurea flapped her wings once, hard. A great gust of wind howled out of the cave, pushing them back. They snarled, folding their wings down so they would not catch the wind and be flung back like living kites. Ash and debris tornadoed away in little dirt devils before dissipating. "Leave me alone! I told you I am not going!" She emerged from the cave, using it as her backing so that they could not encircle her. The chain rattled as she moved. They lowered their heads and snarled at her savagely. She returned the gesture, wings half open and shaking threateningly like a hooded snake might do. They did the same, coming from the same region, much less the same court, tended to yield those of similar fighting styles, if not identical. Azurea knew she could take one of them, but the other would overpower her. Not good. She kept snarling and snapping at them as they closed in slowly, desperately trying to think of a way out. Both of them stopped, for a pair of orange and red eyes were coming up behind the tunnel. Molten, glowing, angry eyes that had been awakened by all the noise and threats. Who dares come to the home of Searanox the Feared? It started as a low rumble, then shook the very air like the vibration of thunder. Azurea felt her joints weaken for a moment at the rolling, thunder-like vibration of the voice. She whirled about. Both guards were backing away quickly, fearful of the newcomer. She backed out of the cave, the guards at her back, and then to one side to separate herself. A large, angry-looking great red dragon emerged from the mountain cavern, casting his searing gaze over all three of them. His wings opened, blotting out the very sun with their thick blackness. Azurea felt her mouth go agape. Her eyes fell open to his horns, which jutted in 6 different ways from his head, and stared at the blades on his tail. The blades flexed open and closed as though alive. He was a paragon of sheer draconic power. "A great red!" one of the 2 guards said dumbly as the angry dragon surveyed all 3 of them. He shouldered up to his comrade, snarling savagely and showing teeth. Searanox's jowls lifted to reveal massive fangs the size of longswords. "Answer me, or forfeit your general health, trespassers." His tail whipped about for a moment, and the sound of drawing swords told them that his tail blades had all sprung free into an aggressive stance. The blue dragons had no answer for this, for their tails were tufted at the end with silky fur. This red dragon was a walking weapon. "This one belongs to us. She ran away," one of the 2 blurted suddenly. Azurea snarled savagely, wings shuddering angrily. "Give her back to us. She is ours." "She lost us only briefly." Searanox's great head swiveled to inspect Azurea for a moment, his eyes flicking over her angry look, her smaller stature and poised for violent stance. "Looks like she wants to stay lost," he rumbled in mild amusement. Azurea's calculating mind was racing. A massive red dragon had entered the mix, aggressive and territory protective, her distant outer focus glaring at nothing while she thought was awarded with a choking jerk on the chain about her neck. She gagged aloud. "You're coming with us." One of the 2 guard dragons was pulling at her chain like she was a stubborn beast of burden. Her wings flapped back and forth out of sync. She choked nonsense in protest, her breath cut off. Searanox merely watched. He gave an idly rattling growl while he watched 2 of them struggle, and the 3rd in awe of the dragon fear that radiated off the great red's body. It was not every day that 1, not 2, but 3 strange dragons appeared on his doorstep, but they seemed more interested in each other than himself, or his territory. Well, he had to do something with the proverbial fist he'd raised. I could throw them out if you want," he offered coyly, grinning swords at the dragoness. Not that he needed permission for violence. He was a great red after all, but the conversation would be so much more interesting. Azurea finally caught her chain and let herself breathe. "Fine, fine. I'll do anything to get them away," she gagged, her joints and body aching with lack of oxygen. Her vision was a bit hazy and she thrashed about like an oily snake held in place by a chain. "What'll you give me?" Searanox chuckled darkly as he watched the violence continue. The 2nd guard startled out of his stupefied gaze and went to help his partner wrestle Azurea to the ground. They worked the rest of the hanging chain around her 4 legs, hog-tying her so she couldn't claw their faces off. "I don't have anything, you great red imbecile. All I have to trade is me. Azurea was snarling and snapping while they wrestled savagely to get her under control. She may have been female, but she was no lesser a fighter than her male counterparts. Just as many teeth, and just as dangerous. "Fair deal," Searanox said after flicking his eyes at her. His black wings opened, and the two male blue dragons were suddenly eclipsed in darkness. They stopped their struggling, a tangle of limbs and tails and teeth as Searanox loomed over them all. The loud choking sound of the first guard was all he could get out before the great red grabbed him by the face and slammed him head first into the ground. He looked like an ostrich, his head buried in the ash. The dragon fear washed anew over the other one as Searanox buried his comrade with one arm. The enormous great red dragon turned like an apocalyptic siege tower, and the blue turned to flee. Grabbing him by the tail, the uncreative great red face crushed the blue into ashen ground as well. The rumbling sound made the trees shudder. Azurea struggled one way as she tumbled along the ground, then another, then back the way she'd come, tangled in long strings of chain. She bumped into a mountain of scales and dark wings. "Don't just stand there," she roared. "Untangle me!" Searanox grabbed a loose end of the chain and yanked hard. Azurea pinwheeled across the ground several times with a yelp, spilling out over the ashen ground, bruised, angry, but unharmed. She finally came to all fours again, in time to see the other two blues were recovering. Searanox regarded them with amusement, and bade Azurea with his eyes to stay put. Dragon fear exploded off of him in a great ring of pure draconic force, so potent she could almost taste it in the air around her. Dragon fear is a potent aura that a dragon gives off, its power and range based on the dragon's powers. Those struck by it are often overcome by a sense of doom and fear, and the more powerful dragons can literally hit enemies with it, much like thunder rattling a windowsill. She did not fear him, for it was not directed at her, but such terrible power, it was devastating. Just as the two blues found their feet and their senses, the great red was before them. Taking a deep breath and throwing his chest out, he aligned his body perfectly along his spine. His black wings opened, pure liquid night. Azurea winced openly at Searanox's roar, concussive thunder laced with dragon fear. It vibrated the air, shuddered the trees, and quieted the forest for miles. On the receiving end, the two blues cowered like hatchlings. By the time he'd run out of breath and drawn anew, both of the blue males had fled to the skies. Searanox laughed, exhilarated. It was a dark and disturbing sound. Azurea sat there feeling rumpled, her mane hanging over her eyes. She puffed air from her lips to push it back behind her horns. When silence fell, she didn't quite know what to do. She watched the two blues fly away with all speed. The forest was dead silent, as though holding its breath. Searanox turned his great head towards Azurea, studying her. He came close, and she stubbornly held her ground with angry eyes. His dragon fear would not overtake her, not one bit. His massive paws reached, and she felt herself tense up. He snapped the collar and chain around her neck, with brutish force his species allowed, tossing it aside. "Thanks," she said shortly. "I do not like chains," Searanox said, his threatening voice turning more approachable now. The overwhelming dragon fear subsided into a low hum. Azurea had not expected it, but frowned at him like a stubborn hatchling nonetheless. "Come with me." It was not a question. "What if I don't?" she snapped defiantly. "Then I'll have my way with you out here and let you be on your way." What?" she shrieked, alarmed. "You can't be serious." "You made the deal, not I," he smirked with the predator's teeth. "All I have to trade is myself, you said," he reminded, chuckling. "I said no such—" She cut herself off, for she had indeed said that. Searanox sat on his haunches, suddenly regal and diplomatic. "Let us look at it this way. You saw my cave? He looked over his shoulder at the entrance. I saw your legs. He grinned in a very male way at her. His head lowered and the glitter of his molten orange eyes shone under his brows. She was so shocked and angry she could not think of a reply. So he went on. I do not know much of sky dragons like yourself, but being chained up and hauled about like a slave does not seem to be the activity of choice for any respectable dragon. He seemed to like to pause, not for breath, but for effect. Some sort of bravado? And lifting my tail for a stranger is? She snapped at him with her teeth. You'd be true to your word, Searanox chuckled darkly, eyeing her with a hungry expression. And if what you said before is true, it's all you have. He loomed over her, smiling with enough arrogance and self-righteousness to make Azurea want to rip his face off. Although, with all the horns atop his head, she would never get a good grip. She snarled at him openly. Follow me, he said shortly, turning and going into the cave in the mountains. She followed. They spiraled down until they came to a lit cavern, and my was it lit! There were torches everywhere, alighting what was probably the biggest single dragon horde she had ever seen. Gold carpeted the floor at least a foot thick. Trinkets and oddities littered the place, and the coins were like sand grains in a desert, piled this way and that. She blinked in acknowledgement of his wealth. For treasure was status among dragons. Not only was he powerful, but an excellent hoarder. Searanox splayed out on his belly over a great mound of gold, which tinkled as it adjusted like a big sandbox under his weight. So, he said finally. So, Azurea said carefully, already uncomfortable and looking into his molten orange and red eyes. His age had long vanished the pupils, and they just seemed to be pits of lava boring into her intently. What is the deal? I got rid of them, as we hastily agreed. But you still have a problem, Searanox said darkly. They'll be back after me, Azurea acknowledged with an angry look. Do you have family? They were the ones shipping me off, forcing me to mate some mindless, self-entitled noble dragon from the Western Territories. Azurea grumped with a toss of her silken mane. Searanox grunted what was probably a laugh. He knew of such dragons. Mindless wasn't the word he would have picked, but close enough. Some place to go? He asked. I was focused on escaping those two that were escorting me. Azurea did not add that she hadn't thought that far ahead. Mating for an alliance is stupid, and the one they picked for me was a cowardly, impotent, sorry excuse for... I see. Searanox bobbed his head a few times. So what you need is sanctuary, not protection. He made a sweeping gesture, for the cavern branched off in many directions, further into the earth. What are you implying? She said sourly at him, eyes narrowing in suspicion. I think you would rather stay in one safe location than run forever. Searanox smiled with many gigantic teeth. And you can provide that? Azurea frowned at him. The great arrogant red? My name is Searanox the Feared. The concussive force of his voice made her sense of balance tingle, but she would not waver. She would not bow. She would not fear. After a few moments of cavernous echoes, he calmed his fiery temper and glared at her. My cave, your tail, he offered with a growl. Azurea's mind was spinning. One leash for another. No, she could argue this one. He seemed to think she was honor bound to their first deal. My own room that you can't enter, she shot back. My protection from others that will come. And they will. He pointed a hooked claw at her. Sanctuary is a powerful word, but it doesn't mean anything if I don't have some place to be completely alone. She jabbed back at him angrily. She would not break or bow to his molten glares. She watched his eyes, hot and calculative, consider briefly. Sanctuary, to a sub-cavern of your choice. He admitted her reasoning correct with a growl. Your tail goes up at least once per week, when I call. I don't come when called. I'm not a dog, you arrogant bastard. She flapped her wings, and the mound of coins between them rushed onto its side with the gale. If you can catch me, then it's fine, she said hotly, angry now that the negotiations were going more and more between her legs and less her way. He considered her. She was smaller, though quicker than he. If he could corner her, he'd have all the warm dragoness he wanted. Snarling in a male way, his jowls lifted in a pleased manner. Sanctuary and catching, he nodded. Freedoms! Azurea was not done yet, and the argument raged on. Over the course of an hour or so, she asserted her day-to-day comings and goings were none of his damn business. Also, that if she brought home anything for her own hoard, it would be in her room and hers, not his. He only seemed certain that he could have her when he pleased, but if sanctuary and well-timed trips could be performed well, then she could avoid that, for the most part. She caught her eyes flicking downward when he sat up on his haunches during their arguing. She was no virgin, but she'd never thought about a red dragon's plumbing. Fierce draconic debate went on down to the last silver piece they would be trading for straw, for bedding, and other accommodations she'd demanded. Finally both sides said done, and it was over. They stared at each other in long silence. Well, what is your name then? He said. You can earn that one. She flicked her forked tongue out at him, then turned and went to go pick out her sanctuary cave. Azurea felt a massive paw close on her tail, just above the tuft of fur on its tip, and looked behind herself in mild shock. Hey! You owe me yourself, dear cloud dragon, he reminded her with a grinning, sword-filled smile. She made a face at him. We said it was only if you could catch me. She tensed her limbs to spring away in case he should get up and try to do just that. She was nimble. She could dodge him. He smirked a bit. That was for our current deal. Our first deal was to get rid of those two imbeciles holding you hostage. They were not holding me hostage. You were in chains, being carted away, he snapped. You offered yourself up, he growled. Now lift your tail, you crabby thing, he challenged. We had a deal. Azurea lifted an angry finger at him, her mouth open for the longest argument ever conceived by dragonkind. But her voice stopped short. He was right. Furious, wronged, and unable to come up with any back doors to the situation, she merely snarled at him. We had a deal, he said again, smiling predatorially from under his crown of horns. This weakened her iron resolve. Slowly, angrily she turned away from him. Wordlessly, she lowered herself and her tail slowly came up. Legs spreading gingerly, she lowered her head with a soft sigh. He was upon her, grasping her hips with his great black claws. Azurea gritted her teeth, forcing down a quiet whimper. A dark chuckle sounded in her ear as his muzzle came near to it. She uttered a swear that only language lessons with a sailor would teach. Just be done with me, she said quietly. Another black chuckle issued from Searanox the Feared. I did not think you would really do it. His weight miraculously lifted from her, abuse-free. She found herself gasping a little, then comically falling forward onto her chest with a grunt. If there is one thing red dragons value, it is upholding the honor of a deal. To see you thus does draw respect from dragons like me. He was still lewdly eyeing her. Then you're not going to? Sex is about passion. I have none. I am heartless, Searanox said coldly, rubbing his chest with the pads of his fingers in a sore way. The sky dragoness looked lost, so he continued. Just like a confession, A deal under duress is no deal at all. Void. Azurea could not believe what she was hearing. Did Great Reds have some sort of law system? They were solitary creatures, surely not. What was he going on about? I shall decide what to do with you later, I promise. His words sent a mild tremor through her, but she steeled herself none the less. Act 1, Part 2. Sanctuary. Azurea awoke, sore in the back and limbs. She wasn't used to sleeping in a cave, but a Cloud City building. It was hard, rough, and her body had angrily rebelled. The dragoness moved her eyes without turning her head, peering at the carpet of gems and golden coins all around her. Waiting until the events of yesterday came back to her, she stirred a little. Searanox had not taken advantage of her, but it had not made it any easier to sleep with his constant growl-snoring. Just then a dead horse flumped down in front of her, startling a yip out of her throat and a slight recoil. It occurred to me, after you fell asleep last night, Searanox had appeared, dropping another horse before her, that you arrived in the late afternoon, and never ate. His voice was deep and syrupy, like a bronze bell that hummed after being struck. Just the right tone to prickle ears with its power. Take your pick, he said, gesturing. It occurred to the blue dragoness that the two dead animals were bleeding all over his mounds of gold and gems, but he certainly didn't seem to mind it, so she didn't say anything. A wave of spontaneous gratitude hit Azurea as she stared at the dead horse before her. Usually her food was killed, cut up, sometimes even cooked, before she ever saw it. The courts had made her feel so lazy and useless as a predator. All she lacked was a servant who wouldn't let her wipe her own ass. But here was the animal, still whole and setting its dead gaze upon her. She pounced upon the closest horse and dug in with all the pent-up ferocity that she'd ever wanted. Searanox watched her for the first few bites before starting into his own. He ripped the head off and tossed it aside, for there was very little meat there, and breakfast was served. Azurea tossed the scraps and unsplintered bones to a little pile to one side after she'd seen Searanox do it himself. "So you live here alone, then?" was the first thing she said to him, despite the food and shelter he'd given her the night before. "I like it. It's quiet and private," Searanox growled. Going over to a corner dune of treasure, he dug lightly with his claws, emerging with a massive, silvery plate of metal. He put it under his arm and reared up on his back legs. She stared at it, maybe as long as her forearm and twice as thick, like a massive road sign. "And speaking of, I believe we had a deal." He gestured with his head towards the deeper tunnels on the far side of the hoard room. "Lead on. You can pick what you like," he told her. Azurea regarded him with a frown. He'd yet to name his end of the deal, but the Great Red had no reason to lie to her thus far. "What's that for? Bars for my cage?" she growled at him nodding at the large metal plate. "It'll keep anything out when I'm done with it," he said, sounding annoyed and rolling his eyes. "Do you want your private room, or would you prefer to sleep with me each night?" That sent her to further growling, but she started towards the deeper tunnels anyway. He chuckled darkly. "How do I know you will not simply lock me up, or somehow give yourself access to my sanctuary?" Azurea said conversationally as they passed sub-cavern after sub-cavern. She glimpsed entire rooms filled with breakable things like expensive pottery, musical instruments, scrolls, anything treasure-like that a dragon could not sleep on top of. She made a mental note of his organizational skills. "Perhaps not among blue dragons, my little cloud snapper, but among red dragons our word is our bond. I cannot lie to you," Searanox rumbled in all seriousness. He didn't sound annoyed or dramatic. It was as though he were just stating a fact. It was like telling a unicorn it was beautiful. It would simply nod, not out of arrogance, but because it was true. "You can't lie, or you won't lie," she pressed. "Either or," he shrugged. "Ah, she said acidly. They'd reached a deeper part of the mountain where there were fewer torches than before, but there were many empty sub-caverns. After perhaps an hour of touring and searching about, Azurea found one that pleased her. The floor was flat, the stalactites did not drip, and it was big enough for her comfort. This one, she gestured, for they'd passed it half a dozen times. Searanox peered inside, seeing that none of his treasures occupied the room, and nodded. "This will be your home," he said. "Though it is part of my lair, it is yours for the time being." The great red dragon made it sound like an announcement. He set the great metal plate he was carrying down on the ground. Azurea's paws leapt to her ears as he lowered a claw over it. Sure enough, his claws sprayed sparks this way and that as... was he writing on it? "You don't have to label the room as mine," she screeched over the horrible sound of claw on metal. "I am not a hatchling, you know." He rolled his eyes. "This is for your protection," Searanox told her. She saw he was writing in the runic alphabet, not the normal draconic one. She couldn't read it upside down and tilted, but soon he turned it upright in both his hands. "Here we are." He leaned up on two legs, breathing fire carefully along the wall above the sub-cavern entrance. The stone groaned and cracked in protest, but it did not fall. Pulling back a moment, Searanox slapped the metal plate over the hot rock like a band-aid, where it stuck like glue. He smiled when it began to glow and flicker brilliantly. Azurea's mane prickled as she felt runic magics activating from the curious spell. "What did you do?" she asked, for she saw a small cascade of sparkling magic waterfalling over the archway. "It's Wishplate, a permanent spell holder. It's cast over this archway now. Step through so it registers," he gestured. Azurea slowly approached, then quickly snaked through the archway so not many of the sparkles touched her. The metal plate set itself deeper into the wall, then went dark. Searanox nodded. "This archway is now protected. None may enter except you, without dying first." He saw her look of disbelief and raised a slow, powerful paw. Leaning forth with one of his hooked claws, he winced when the plate guarding the archway suddenly lit up and crackled with powerful magics. Searanox's claw was severed to a stump as though burned by molten lava. He stuck his finger in his mouth, lapping at it a little. No bits of claw littered the ground. It was simply gone. There was some sort of violent force field between Searanox and the room beyond. "It is attuned to your body, because you passed through it first," he explained, backing up so she could come out again. When she did, it tingled, like she was being passed over by so many cat whiskers. But it did not harm her. Satisfied, he showed her the severed claw again. "What keeps you from just bursting through the wall?" she gestured after a few moments. "Surely a dragon of his size could bash the wall down if he pleased." "The immeasurable mountain of stone above us." Searanox gestured with his muzzle towards the ceiling. "The mountain is very, very carefully carved. Knocking out the wrong wall could be... well, messy." He snickered at her form under his eyebrows. Azurea nodded, shaken but grateful. Perhaps this great arrogant brute was not so one-dimensional after all. "So, you can't lie, you say?" she said, grinning a bit now that the show was over. "That must be compromising." "Not as much as you'd think." He turned, going back towards the main cavern. His tail blades flexed open, then closed again. His massive paws thrummed as they returned to the hoard area. "Why not? No secrets in your tiny little mind?" "None that don't eventually get too personal for the person asking questions." Searanox grinned swords at her. "Be careful what you ask, my little cloud snapper. The truth is often ugly." Azurea could not help it. Her curious nature compelled her. "How long have you been here?" "Decades." "How old are you?" "I stopped keeping track beyond adulthood." "Siblings?" 13 of them." "Why did you save me?" she said in a softer voice, hoping to catch him off guard. "Seemed like a good idea at the time." and I love taking proverbial candy from babies." He grinned darkly, lying out on his belly, atop a mound of gold and gems. "And you seem like you might be fun for a bit." He shrugged his massive shoulders. "Oh, very good. Your eyes went straight to my haunches," she said acidly. "Oh no, I looked at your horns first, then your backside," he chuckled even as he said it, but she quivered in anger. "You shallow, red, blasted, you're just angry that your blue males are smaller, less masculine, and cannot please you in the worst ways like I could." He flicked his forked tongue at her nastily. Her eyes bulged and she fell into a choking silence, unable to find the words for her coiled and pressurized anger. "Good thing you found me." He snickered. She had no comeback. She could not conjure one cruel enough. His arrogance, his ego. It was just too much. Immeasurable. She stalked away from him enough to make him lift his head and inquire, "Where are you going?" "Out," she said with venom. "Where to?" he asked. "Out," she snapped. "My freedom, remember? We had a deal." Turning, she snaked out of the cavern and finally to the outside. The ashy veil was damp with the rain that had poured last night. Searanox did not follow, which was a blessing. The evening air was not cold enough to calm her fuming anger. Going to a nearby river, she slipped in without making a splash. She corkscrewed through its darkest, coldest depths, trying to soothe herself. She emerged, curving her neck and paddling slowly along the current. He had kept his word, the foul-mouthed, arrogant, overzealous bastard that he was. This Azurea had to admit. He said he would save her, and he did. He said she could have sanctuary, and she did. He'd fed her, and was generally an armored thing that she could jab with insults with no lasting impression. Back at the courts, she could spend weeks trying to get back into good graces after one or two barbed comments. Was Searanox more dragon than the blue dragons she had always known? Or was she more wild than they, like he was? She did not know. The dull ache from sleeping on stone was gone, and she felt a bit stronger than before. She frowned, coming up onto the river bank and shaking briskly. One might think dragons shook like dogs did, but the real story was that dogs shook like dragons did. Her mane finally lay down once more, damp. Thunder rolled in the distance. It was going to rain again that night. She could feel it on the wind. Turning, Azurea came back to the ashy clearing that served as the front lawn of Searanox's lair. She eyed the twin holes where the great red had shoved the faces of her enemies into the ground with one arm. Cocking her head, she gave a troubled huff. It was a few hours later when the rain started and Azurea returned to a quiet evening of thinking in her own room. Searanox had been napping quietly on a gold mound in the hoard room. The falling dusk and the cool, rain-pregnant wind. The winds did not agree with him. She found a set of 6 or 8 hay bales she had never seen before next to the entrance of her sanctuary. He must have put them there for her. She took them into her room, scattering them into a primitive nest-like structure. It wasn't very soft, because of her size, but she could get more later. Azurea lay there, curled in a circle, thinking with a furrowed brow. She despised anything and everything that got in her way to living a more exhilarating and draconic life, a life away from the courts and the arranged marriages and politically aligned phonies that called themselves friends. Yet, here she was in a deep cave, living with a great red dragon who seemed to want little else than someone else to trade barbs with. Regardless of whatever motives he was withholding, since he'd yet to name his end of their hastily decided bargain. She was silent when she thought about it, but she admitted that it could have been worse. Azurea awoke among the flattened straw. She groaned a little. Even after almost a week, she was not used to sleeping on a hard surface like stone. It ached her back and often left her legs cramped in the early mornings. However, She could already feel her hatchling fat slowly melting from her limbs as the more active, fleshy lifestyle of living with Searanox the Feared took hold. She was turning a bit leaner, and despite it having been only a week, she liked the thought very much. Turning more muscle and scale than anything would certainly be a great advantage out in the real world, away from the sky courts. She stood and stretched painfully. Her remarkably bare room greeted her, and her well-adjusted eyes squinted when she stuck her head out into the hall. Hungry. She was hungry. Perhaps Searanox had brought home more horses for her to eat. Thrumming up the tunnel path and keeping her wings folded from the walls, she emerged into the grand treasure room. She saw a great dip in the carpet of gold and gems, where he had been sleeping the night before. Maybe he's gone hunting or something. She poured a little at the seemingly endless shiny metals and priceless finery that he used to line his floor. It briefly occurred to Azurea to wonder why Searanox had no mate. He seemed powerful, hoard successful, and his home was enormous. Surely a breeding female or two had approached him at some point. With his foul-mouthed libido, it wasn't a wonder he wasn't surrounded by hatchlings. She rolled her eyes, grunting audibly. The blue dragoness wandered outside for fresh air and blanched. Searanox was in the ashy clearing outside his lair, sprawled out on his back. Was he dead? She inhaled sharply, thinking him so, until one of his forepaws battered at nothing at all, and she saw his eyes were closed. Cocking her head, she realized he was napping in the mid-morning sun. Sighing and rolling her eyes, she studied him, splayed out with all four legs in the air, tail laying in an S curve, looking very content, napping. She would have called out or tossed a rock at him, but did not. Despite all his unbelievable arrogance, he'd actually treated her rather well since she'd arrived. Tossing a stone at someone called the Feared didn't seem especially smart, no matter how ridiculous and undignified he looked, splayed out like that. The beating of wings tore her from her thoughts, and she looked around quickly. Twin shadows were descending from on high, out of the clouds. Retreating quickly into the mouth of the cave, Azurea watched them approach, until they became more recognizable shapes. She swore. It was the two blue dragons that had been transporting her to the arranged marriage before she'd taken up residence with Searanox. The same ones. They landed hard, the ground shivering at their practiced unison. Azurea eyed Searanox. Living weapon though he was asleep. No, he stirred. You two again, he said, yawning a half roar as he shifted his weight to the side. What is it now? The twin blues were in heavier armors than before. It was strange to see perfectly scaled dragons wearing metal protection atop their natural protection. But so dire was the threat that they'd come to face that it seemed necessary. It must have made flying a serious labor with all that extra weight on their bodies. We're here to reclaim Azurea from your filthy claws, fire-breather. Searanox lazily turned upright. His black wings opened, then refolded to work the ache out. Now stand aside before you. Your arranged marriage is void. She's lifted her tail for me. She's damaged goods. He cocked his head one way, then the other. From a hiding spot, Azurea's jaw dropped at the audacity of the bluntness of his words. Both guards stared at him in disbelief. You're lying, one of them said, pointing a hooked claw at Searanox. Nope. He shrugged a bit, his voice deep and syrupy. Azurea didn't know whether to tear his face off with her claws, or to thank him for the sudden perfect release thanks to his half-truths. She was no virgin, but it had not occurred to her that arranged marriages usually expected virgin females. Now she was not only perhaps off the hook for that, but the Great Red had taken credit and granted immunity to her unnamed former lovers. Genius. Now which of you has the stones to attack me head on? He looked back and forth between the two of them. they seemed undecided, since Searanox was almost time and a half bigger than they. The sheer difference of weight, much less strength, would have been a serious disadvantage to whomever stepped forward. Azurea emerged from the cavern, now that things were more in order, like graceful quicksilver. The two blue dragons eyed her up and down with both shock and questioning eyes. "I do not think even your great ego could surmount a 2-on-1 fight, Searanox the Feared," she said, throwing out her chest in an aggressive stance. Her tail whipped about, tossing loose ash. "Surely you'd allow me some of the fun?" "Oh, please, ladies first," Searanox begged her pardon, suddenly upright and formal when his full name and title were used properly. The twinkle in his eye told of mischief and scandal, though. Azurea sized up both of the armored dragons before them, as though she was picking between eating a cow and eating another cow. One of them seized the opportunity and leapt upon Searanox with all speed. The great red reared as quickly as he could, wrapped his arms around his assailant's middle, and pulled backward until his attacker landed hard on his head. Searanox quickly recovered, but his victim was not so quick, who emerged from the head crater with a shaken sense of balance. Just then Azurea leapt upon her opponent, and the battle was on. Searanox watched his opponent take wing, and spread his wings. Following him into the air, he soon realized that a sky dragon would, of course, have a massive advantage in the sky. Igniting his inner kiln with an audible click, he fired a fireball across his enemy's tail. The victim's shriek, tail tuft catching flame as he veered back and forth. The trail of smoke made the great red laugh in earnest. Searanox rode a thermal of air, then folded his wings and dove like a 10-ton weight, landing hard on his opponent and knocking him out of the air. Searanox practically straddled him as they fell. The ground rushed up to meet them, and they crashed headlong into the mountainside. Stunned and weakened, the sky dragon no longer had a chance. The great red pinned him with his sheer weight, and roared a stream of fire over his opponent's head, melting it. The blackened skull hissed and then burst open from violent heat stress. Dead. Untangling himself from the headless body, Searanox turned just in time to see a spear almost clip Azurea's wing membrane and stray into the trees. That spear was never found again, having done little good once it was thrown. Azurea and her opponent danced, but, fighting in the same style with the same priorities in battle, brought little way of results. The tails slapped each other instead of their targets. Claws met claws instead of faces. Wing clips met wing clips. No amount of wind they could force up magically could overpower the other. The dragoness began to pant with exertion, when Searanox suddenly plunged from the sky and flattened the remaining blue dragon into the ground. The spray of blood from his muzzle was magnificent, and the red dragon's sheer weight shattered most of the ribcage into a horrible bloody mess. The clear weight difference between blue dragons and red dragons was suddenly spelled out for Azurea, who stared in painted horror. Blood pooled around Searanox as he daintily stepped off his opponent. "You all right?" he said gruffly, shaking the gore from his back paws. "Such power." He was mine!" Azurea scolded him after a few moments of stunned silence. She spotted the other dead dragon plastered on the mountainside. Searanox hadn't needed her help at all, she realized. It was all a game to him. "What happened to ladies first?" she demanded. "I got bored with mine," he snipped a little. "I wanted yours too." He regarded the pile of scales, bone, and gore right next to him. The death stare on the dead dragon's face was horrified and wide-eyed. "Besides, perfectly symmetrical fighting never solved anything," he said snootily. Azurea felt her face go hot. "You have to fight dirty sometimes." His tail lifted to one side for a moment, for he'd not used it at all, and he flexed the blades a few times. He hadn't even been fighting his hardest, she suddenly knew. "How do you manage to stay so So arrogant, Azurea exploded after a long tense moment of fuming. I simply do things better than those around me. Searanox didn't hesitate to answer. When you are the best or the most powerful, you're allowed. Trust me, I know, he chuckled. That's not a reason, she shouted. I promised to protect you, he said. That was the deal. He pointed at her dangerously, his molten eyes flaring with the fiery temper behind them. She snarled at him, but the arrogant smile returned, for he knew he'd won this particular round. Tell you what, he amended with an odd smile, I will have something for you later, a gift, and you will feel better. Azurea stalked away, angry into the cave to be alone. Searanox was left in the ashy clearing, snickering softly. He looked over at his latest conquest. What? He asked the dead dragon. It's not as though I lied. He reached over and made the head shake some. Do not be that way. No dragon appreciates a sore loser, he scolded, before snickering again. Moving to the near middle of the ashy yard, he began to dig. When he was satisfied with the size of the hole, he moved the corpse of the dragon, then buried it under a thick layer of ash. He left the one plastered on the mountainside where it was. The vultures would take care of that, and the skeleton would make a good trophy, a warning to any who intruded in his territory. He smiled. It was some hours later, almost evening, when Searanox stuck his head around the corner of Azurea's sanctuary room. He dared not cross the threshold, for it would have killed him, but he got close. Azurea, he said melodically. The sparkle of mischief in his eyes and the thrumming of his paws had returned. She regarded him from her half-nest with a venomous glare, one paw folded over the other. She looked like the regal thing that she was. He cocked his head, waiting in silence. Hey, Azurea, he tried again. She continued to glare at him. Your gift is here, he said the short sentence quickly, then slowly melted back around the corner without saying another word to her. It took perhaps 10 seconds for the burning curiosity to get the better of her. The blue dragoness emerged, going up the tunnel and towards the hoard room. Searanox was waiting there for her, and a beat-up wooden cart was present as well. It looked odd amongst all his mounds of gold, gems, and finery. He nodded towards it as she came closer, and found a rabbit-folk woman tied to it, naked, save the ropes that held her to a stake, and a bag on her head. She squirmed and writhed. What in Bahamut's name? Azurea gasped aloud. It's a virgin sacrifice, Searanox elated at her. Our fighting caused such a noise that the local town assumed I was angered for some reason, and sought to appease me with a sacrifice. He gestured with not one, but both front paws, as though it were the greatest gift ever conceived. As though your ego needed inflating, she said mildly, leaning down and peering at the prisoner. The bloodied stocks on the front of the cart said that the horses were gone, as did the drip of red on Searanox's muzzle. Sacrificing to you like a god, she snorted. Want to see how it works? Suddenly all his threats and regal poising was left behind. He was like a hatchling with a new plaything. He whipped the bag off the rabbit woman's head, leaned in quite close to her face and shouted, "Hello!" obnoxiously, smiling with teeth as long as her arm. She replied with a panicked scream of terror, and lines of yellow going down her inner thighs. "You're terrible," Azurea sighed, her hand coming up to palm an oncoming migraine. The rabbit woman writhed and panicked and peed herself while the two dragons stared at her with completely different expressions. You can play with her, or eat her, or pull her limbs off one by one. Searanox named different interesting things that could be done with virgin sacrifices. I'm letting her go. What? Searanox choked on his own spit when she said this. She's ours now, though. We need to eat her at least. It's only polite. He gestured with all his claws to their prize. You said she was a gift to me. If I want to release her back into the wild, I can, Azurea said. Or were you lying to me? She trapped the great red dragon in his own honor system. He could not lie, for it was greatly dishonorable to red dragons. Caught in his own logic, Searanox could say nothing nor follow as Azurea smugly wheeled the cart outside. The exasperated look and the hungry glare at the rabbit-folk woman was worth more than any gift. The woman was not stupid, and stayed silent during the whole ordeal. "Thank you," she said in a small voice as the ropes fell away from her. "I am eternally grateful." "Do a favor for me," Azurea said, lowering her head down to be eye to eye with the rabbit-folk woman. She quivered with Dragon Fear's grip on her, but listened intently. "Tell them to send horses from now on. We dragons have tired of your virgins." She made a vague, go-on gesture, and the woman ran like a scared... well, you know. Act 1, Part 3. Games. Azurea was pacing around the hoard room, her wings opened, then refolded, then opened again, then refolded again. Searanox was lazing about on a mound of gold and gems, eyeing her with a curious gaze. It had been raining for days and days, and his little blue ward was getting cave fever. Understandable, being a creature of the sky. She was going to burst and say something. He could see it by her quivering brow. He just wasn't sure what it would. "What do you do around here all day?" She suddenly exploded at him, turning with an angry glare. "It's so boring." "Well, at least you've settled in and calmed down enough to wonder such things. I attend no courts or political meetings like the sky dragons do." The great red sat up, then came up onto his haunches. He looked like a statue of everything magnificently draconic, upright, regal, brilliantly coloured, and with eyes that shone in the half-light. Azurea glared at him, waiting still for the answer. "Well, I have a game room, for rainy days." He gestured vaguely to one side. She stared at him, the tuft of her tail whipping about just a bit. "Game room?" she said curiously, and instantly he knew he had her. If anything, Azurea's curiosity was her greatest strength, and her greatest weakness, he'd learned. "You play games?" She said it like she didn't believe him. "Just one. Come, I'll show you." He smirked with great arrogance, dragging the blades on his tail along the carpet of treasures as he went by. She followed with some eagerness, while she had doubts that the massive red brute played anything sophisticated like chess or Farland checkers. It would be interesting to see what he did think of as a fun game. "You live alone, you told me," Azurea said, her brow furrowing a bit as they went down the tunnels. "Who do you play with?" She cocked her head a little. He seemed to be thinking about his answer for a long time, and they came to a great door. It was an odd thing to see, a dragon using a doorway in his own lair. It was metallic, and decorated with fancy designs and swirling shapes. "I play the room," Searanox said, and this only puzzled her more. He pushed firmly on the door. It swung open soundlessly, and as the great red opened the way, he spoke a command word. All of the torches in the room sprang to life, revealing the oddest thing Azurea had ever seen. There were little models of landscapes perched all around the room. Some were attached to the walls, others looked like tables, others were on the floor, big enough to kneel and inspect more closely. They were painted and carved down to the finest detail. The blue dragoness was fascinated and went inside. On the shelves were dozens and dozens of little metal figurines and buildings, little knights, peasants, castles, wizards, and all sorts of things in between. There was a small army of little archers, and even a catapult or two. Azurea blinked with interest, going over and picking up the little metal knight in her fingers. Much to her shock, it wiggled in her grasp, then leapt to her palm. It drew its sword all on its own and stood at attention. "It's alive!" she gasped, eyes shining. "It's enchanted," Searanox agreed. "Game room!" he suddenly shouted to the ceiling. Azurea's stomach lurched as powerful magics washed over them both. It was some sort of consciousness, as though the room itself was looking at them. She couldn't quite put words to it. It felt like 1,000 tiny little hairs had wrapped around her mind and were listening intently. "Game room? New game," Searanox commanded. Suddenly everything in the room jumped into motion. Azurea shrieked in brief panic, ducking as pieces flew off the shelves. Landscapes moved from their resting positions, arranging and configuring themselves into a much larger, flat shape that was chest-high. The model castles flew off the shelves and then settled on the grand landscape. The little soldiers, knights, and wizards all divided themselves evenly, and, by magic, morphed into the colors red and blue. Azurea suddenly grasped it when all of the flying game pieces had come to a rest. "It's a war game," she said, enchanted at the size and scale of it all. "The biggest I've ever seen." Searanox smiled genuinely at her praise, a crooked and coy expression she'd not ever seen before. "You can play against another dragon, or against the room itself. It even adjusts its difficulty so you don't get crushed while you learn how to play." "Will you teach me?" she said with big soft eyes and grand interest. Never mind asking him if she could even touch anything in the room, or was even allowed to play with it at all. She wanted to play right then. "I could teach you," he said slowly, for thunder was rumbling outside. It had been raining for almost a week now, on and off. It made the fire dragon weary to see the world so soggy for so long. So he stayed to his mountain home, all the better to have a living opponent for his favorite game, rather than a silent presence to play with. Azurea placed the knight carefully on an open plain landscape, and it scurried along until it rejoined its comrades. "I warn you, though, I'm heartless. You'll have to learn by losing." He grinned at her with a mouthful of sword-length teeth. She rolled her eyes, nodding some. "Show me." Azurea stared at the board, for the hundreds of pieces that moved over it had jumbled together in a mass of blue and red and landscaping colors. It hurt her eyes a little. "Archer takes wizard." She touched an archer who was perched on a tiny hill, then pointed to a nearby red-colored wizard piece. The archer promptly drew an arrow and shot, the wizard falling over. Searanox removed the dead piece, placing it in the pile that had slowly been growing over the past few hours. The game was long, complex, and interesting. Certain pieces could only take certain other pieces in a sort of rock, paper, scissors fashion. The landscape played a big role for a chance to hit, for there was always a chance that an attack could miss. There were plenty of little tricks and traps that went with it as well. Searanox had spent the last hour slowly edging a group of soldiers up a tiny little volcano. Azurea eyed this tactic, sure that it meant something, crowding her archers into a model of a castle so they would be safe. Soldiers to volcano summit. Searanox reared up a bit as all 6 of the soldier pieces flung themselves to their dooms. Azurea blinked in shock. He'd destroyed 6 of his own pieces. The volcano hissed and sputtered and belched a little bit of smoke. A new and much larger figure than the others emerged. It was still a figurine, but it was more detailed and scary looking. It was a black knight with flame patterns all over his armor. "Summon the lava knight," the red dragon gloated. Azurea protested. "I didn't know you could do that. I wouldn't have let you take the volcano area so easily if you could summon super pieces from it like that." She growled at his trickery, for he'd said nothing of this particular game mechanic. "I told you you would learn by losing." There are dozens of hidden little things on the board. When it's configured one way or another, he gestured to the little fault lines that showed where the board could be rearranged by the room itself when new games came about. The terrain would never be the same twice, so the game was always different. "Soldier to Rocky Hill," the blue dragoness grumbled. She touched the appropriate piece, and it went to the location. Suddenly a little shimmer opened a hidden hole in the model. A tiny little minecart filled with gold specks wheeled out on a track that rolled out like a tongue. "What's that?" she pondered, leaning with interest. "You found the hidden gold mine. It moves around, so you never know what landmark it's under." Searanox grumbled at her discovery. "You get one of your dead pieces back every turn for 10 turns. He grudgingly handed them over to her from a pile of dead pieces. Azurea chuckled. "Part of it is luck, I see." Her tail whipped around a bit, excited for the novelty and the grand scale of the game. She placed her revived pieces around the base of the volcano where Searanox's lava knight was slowly making its way down. It looked strong, but it was very, very slow. "He'll be outnumbered by the time he gets down the mountainside," she sneered at him, competitive. "We'll see." He reached into a model of a forest, wheeling a pair of catapults forward into view. Catapult takes soldier. The tiny siege engine flicked a pebble halfway across the board and clonked against a blue soldier piece, knocking it over. Azurea rolled her eyes as he chuckled at his own brilliance. "We've been playing for hours and hours," the blue dragon said after another 20 minutes of her combating the lava knight and catapults with her soldiers and archers. "When does it end?" "It ends when one side's castle is taken," Searanox said sagely. He gestured to his own castle, a heart of all things on its double doors, then to hers, which had a swirling air rune on its doors. Searanox began moving his lava knight to the base of the mountain at last. Lava knight converts lava land into lava cracks. He made a sweeping gesture with his claws. Azurea's band of waiting soldiers literally melted into goo. Searanox didn't reach for them, but chuckled as she stared at him slack-jawed. She spent another 20 minutes chasing the lava knight across the board with archers, since direct combat was obviously a bad idea. When it was finally felled, Searanox's little armies had closed in on Azurea's castle. She moaned inwardly, for she'd fallen for the distraction. All she had defending were archers, and they did poorly against the wide array of pieces he'd sent there. Searanox chuckled when he ended the game, picking up the model of the castle and crushing it into his paw. Azurea's pieces fell this way and that, landing in the dead pile. "I didn't expect you to win your very first game, but you did well." She pouted at him over her loss. "You wrecked one of your models," she said at last, satisfied that he'd at least broken something expensive. "Game room." Searanox addressed the entity that was the room once more. The lurch of powerful magics made Azurea shiver a little as the throne room came to attention. The spider webs of magic encased her mind once more, attentive and silent. "Reset." Suddenly, as though time had wrenched itself in reverse, everything in the room started rushing back to its resting place. Game pieces leapt backward, up onto the shelves. Models detached themselves from the landscape and found their homes on the shelves. The landscape itself sectioned, then flew in all directions to disassemble the game. Azurea ducked this way and that, though Searanox stayed still and nothing hit him. The room fell silent, just the way it was when they had first come in. The model Searanox had crushed had remade itself, and was sitting good as new on the shelf with the other models. Azurea blinked. "This must have cost a fortune. Who made it?" she said, eyeing the upper shelves and all the neat little things and pieces that had made up the grander whole. "The architect," Searanox said, "with a capital A." "Fine, keep your secrets." Azurea stuck her forked tongue out at him, storming past. Her ego was bruised from her easy loss, and this suddenly clamming up about the game's origin made her jealous. She'd certainly never seen anything like it before. It was an amazing, magical, complex toy, and he coveted it. She could tell, right down to the silly, heart-marked red castle. Azurea woke in her own room. It had been some days since the rains had stopped, but the world was still soggy, and that made Searanox cranky. So she'd opted to stay in her own room, if not be out and about where he could not poke and prod at her. Figuratively, that is. She'd gotten used to catching live food, and marveled at how few larger animals thought to look skyward before it was too late and she had snatched something off its feet in mid-flight. More of her hatchling fat had disappeared over time, and she was feeling slimmer, racier, and certainly stronger than before. Not that she was fat before, but she was certainly softer. Now she was taking shape into something nature had intended her to be, and she could not have been happier. She'd taken to bringing things into her room to make a larger, softer bed. But leaves tended to dry up and get crunchy, branches were no good and poked her in the night. So she ended up raising a local barn and stealing quite a few straw bales to line her room with. It was quaint, but it wasn't an arranged marriage like the outside world of sky dragon politics promised her. At least Searanox had thicker scales than a politician. Rolling her eyes at the thought of him, she stretched lazily, then stopped. Searanox was moving about in the hoard room, by the sound of it, quickly too. He never rushed anywhere that she knew of, shaking like a dog to wake herself and foofing her tail tuft-free. She started down the tunnels and towards him. The blue sky dragoness stopped in the doorway, then quickly crouched so she could watch him unnoticed. The great red dragon was rushing back and forth in a frenzy, smoothing out a great open area amongst the dunes and dunes of his massive treasury. Was he cleaning? No. No, that would be nothing like him. Aha! Searanox suddenly bent and dug something out of the mounds of raw wealth, a large, ornate chest. He flipped the lid open, and Azurea gasped so loudly that she put her paw over her muzzle. Blood rubies! A whole cache of blood rubies, as big as acorns. Not that the other gems littered about around the floor were unimpressive, but a whole chest of them? Amazing! They glittered like the blood of a godlike golem, shimmering with their own inner light. The raw amount of gold those gems were worth could fund a small nation for years. Azurea knew. She watched him shut the lid and drag the chest over to the flat area. Then he started grooming. Like a great cat, he licked himself here and there, trying to wrestle his mane and other features to look nicer than normal. The blue dragoness was puzzled, to say the least. He didn't normally act like this. Blinking, she watched him groom and level himself as he waited for something. He kept looking expectantly at the far wall, the flattest part of the cave. Azurea could tell tools had been used to make the surface sheer and perfect, a flat space. Suddenly, the magic hit her like a wave of unbelievable power. It was like dragon fear, but no, it was something far more pressing. A presence that invoked stomach aches and jittering wingtips was upon the mountain lair. She fell to all four knees with an audible gasp. Thankfully she was hidden in shadow. Her mouth opened with a gagging sound. She clutched at the ground with her claws, as though it would blow her away. What in the name of Behemoth was that unbelievable magical presence? She sank to her belly like a crawling snake, moaning as the ground under her began to shake. She looked upon Searanox as he drew himself up, sat on his haunches, and perfected his posture. The great presence pressed the unprepared Azurea to the floor like a great suppressive blanket made of lead. The mountain lair itself was shaking, and a few pebbles rained from the ceiling. Then, along the flat of the far wall, a golden portal opened. The very essence of space and time seemed to rip at the seams like old fabric, then form a perfect swirling circle. It cast a golden light over Searanox, who shuddered visibly and squinted his eyes. The magical pressure pressed hard onto him, and made his long neck hunch a little. Steeling himself, he clenched his teeth in a raw display of draconic power. Azurea whimpered, trying to prop her head so she could see straight. It was like an endless well of melted, magical golden presence. A shape emerged from the portal, a small figure. The dragoness blinked in shock. It was quite small, much like the rabbit folk woman Azurea had to let go of days before. But it was not a rabbit folk. She studied it closely as it walked open the flat carpet of treasure that Searanox had smoothed out. Approaching the great red dragon, it was completely covered in golden armor, so thoroughly that neither hide nor hair nor scales were showing anywhere. The figure could have been any of the mortal races, and Azurea would not have known. The vague presence of green eyes were under the visor-like opening in the helm, but only just barely bright enough to see. The rest of her, it was apparently a her for the armor had shaped breasts on the chest plate, shone like a demigod. Azurea squirmed. Searanox bent at the middle and bowed low. The blue dragoness's breath caught in her throat. What sort of being brought Searanox the Feared to his proverbial knees, much less down into a bow like that?
I have come as promised, heartless Searanox,
the golden-armored figure said in a voice that was many voices, but mostly feminine.
And I have your purchase ready.
She gestured vaguely to the portal behind her. Thank you, architect, Searanox said politely. This was just too much for Azurea. Bowing, politeness, respect, and what was a shade of fear on his brow? Wait, architect? Her mind flashed back to a few days earlier when she had asked the red dragon who had built the game room. He'd said, the architect with a capital A. It suddenly hit Azurea once more that Searanox never lied about anything. He'd been telling the truth. The crafter of the grand and sentient game room was called Architect. And what a being she turned out to be. I have your payment here, of course. His words pulled the dragoness from her thoughts, and she watched as he pushed forth the chest full of blood rubies. He gingerly pulled it open so the architect could see how full it was and how shiny the gems inside were. I know you prefer gold, but your pricing could have cleared most of my hoard room out. Selling the gems will give you the equivalent value in gold, he added quickly, looking genuinely unsettled as he spoke. The architect's eyes flicked over the wealth and finery. She nodded shortly.
I do not need to count them, Searanox. I trust you not to cheat me.
There was a mild edge there that even made Searanox nod dumbly. No dragon alive would dare cheat this shining, golden thing, Azurea knew. The raw magic that its mere presence brought on would bring most to their knees. She didn't want to imagine this creature angry. Searanox closed the chest and pushed it rather timidly to the architect's side, then sat on his haunches upright and formal. You finished it, then? He cocked his head with barely disguised grand interest. The architect nodded, making a slow sweeping gesture with one hand as though signaling for someone behind her to come forth. Through the portal a glass sphere came. It was big, perhaps 3 feet in diameter. It smelled odd to Azurea's supernatural senses. She was no sorceress, but she doubted Searanox would pay a chest full of blood rubies for a great lump of glass.
A storm orb, as requested, perfectly functional and 100-year guarantee.
The architect levitated it before the great red dragon, who eyed it with sparkling, happy eyes. With another gesture, the architect claimed the chest of blood rubies and had it float back through the portal behind her. She folded her arms, letting him inspect it. He leaned back and forth, as though checking for cracks or blemishes.
It's also shatterproof, as you asked. Dropping it from a great distance will make a crater, not a mess of shards.
It's perfect, he said in a softer voice, leaning and lapping his forked tongue over it greedily. Azurea wrinkled her nose. Thank you.
Wealth moves by hand,
the architect said, bizarre voice still gendering back and forth, but staying mostly feminine. The shimmering golden creature regarded Searanox closely.
Can I expect another order from you sometime soon?
The great red dragon nodded quickly.
Good.
She tossed him what looked like a black and cold coin, though much larger than the average coin.
You know how to reach me?
She turned mechanically while Searanox loved and licked on his new storm orb. The architect locked eyes with Azurea as she turned to face the portal. The blue dragoness's heart stopped, for the eyes lingered on her. It was like looking into the gaze of a god. She shuddered and her head lowered itself, the magical pressure of the creature's golden presence too much. She fought back fretful tears of panic and bowed her head as she had seen Searanox do. Goodbye, the great red offered as the architect started towards the portal, no longer interested in Azurea. Searanox had still not noticed his tenant hiding in the tunnel.
Goodbye for now, heartless Searanox,
the architect said in her odd voice, stepping through the portal. When she was gone, the portal wrenched itself closed with a pop of compressed air. The massive magical presence faded, and the cave stopped rumbling and shuddering. The mountain settled with a moan of pressing stone. Azurea flopped down, panting, happy she was some distance from Searanox, where he could not hear her. Such a terrible, terrible thing. Its magic was like an endless golden well, and its eyes. Those eyes would haunt her for many a night. She gulped air, just trying to breathe after the sudden absence of the aura it had given off. It was as though she had been weighed down on the chest with sandbags for several hours, then had them taken off and was told to run for a bit. It was exhilarating, but also a little dizzying. The blue dragoness staggered away and down the tunnel while Searanox tossed his new purchase up and down as though it weighed nothing. Azurea didn't know what a storm orb was, but right then she didn't care. She had just risen from sleep, and now she felt the need to collapse. She came into her room, passing through the tingling sanctuary barrier and collapsing onto the straw surface. Panting, she reached for a bowl of water she'd taken from Searanox's storeroom. Lapping greedily, she lay there and panted lightly. Just being around that godlike thing, she felt as though she'd been looked at under a lens and pressed under glass. She was exhausted. Azurea! Azurea! Searanox was coming down the tunnel. Rise, rise, you lazy thing! I've something to show you. He stood on her threshold, coaxing, held back by the sanctuary spell. Get up, he said louder and louder. He never had the inkling that she hadn't even been awake and watching him earlier. Azurea's head pounded, and her tail came up, pulling on a little rope she'd installed next to the entrance of her little lair. Suddenly, a thick velvet blanket fell like a curtain across the entire entryway of her home. Searanox wrinkled his nose in shock. Oh, so offended that he could not see her any more, and could do nothing about it. Let me sleep, her voice floated, mostly muted through the thick of the covering. The great red flicked a fireball between his teeth to burn the blanket, but the sanctuary spell stopped it, exploding it into little orange sparks. He wilted some, frustrated. Meanwhile, Azurea went back to sleep, her head throbbing. Some days it did not pay to be so magically sensitive to the auras of others. Act 1, Part 4. Heartless. Azurea awoke, a little too warm. The velvet covering over her sanctuary had made the place stuffy. The migraine that the architect had brought onto her poor head had passed, though, thank Behemoth. Sitting up and stretching, she regarded her bedding with a new sigh. She'd heard that sleeping on hard surfaces was good for one's back, but that still didn't make it very comfortable. The Blue Dragoness longed to sleep out in the hoard room, but she really did prefer the privacy. She pulled the velvet covering aside and rehung the rope, so when she pulled it again the blanket would cover the archway again. She'd actually shut Searanox out with it, and since he could not go through the sanctuary spell, it was like true privacy. Emerging out into the tunnels, she came to the hoard room and wondered what sort of mischief the Great Red would be up to this morning. He'd gotten a new toy only the day before, but he'd not shown it to her directly yet. She unfolded her wings, stretched, and yawned loudly. Looking around, she did not see the Great Red at home. Going to the front entrance of the lair, she found that it was pouring down in torrential geysers of rain. The ashy clearing that was covered with bones and rusty armor pieces was practically flooding. Suddenly she heard a sound on the blowing wind. Was that laughter? She cocked her head, trying to listen through the torrential rain. Yes it was. It was Searanox. She shuddered at the dark and disturbing sound, but something was making him incredibly jubilant. Azurea went outside, shuddering at the instant soaking she received. Tracking the sound slowly, she saw his great red form perched on a high cliff far in the distance. The wind was carrying his laughter, and lightning split the sky to illuminate him. He hated rain. What was he doing out there? Spreading her wings and carefully taking flight, she flew in a wide arc and low to the canopy until she got to him. Ah ha ha ha! He was sitting on his haunches, looking back and forth as lightning split the sky over and over.
There, and there too! Ah!
Each time he pointed in a random direction, lightning would blast the air and thunder would explode across the sky. His tail was waggling back and forth like a happy hatchling, the closed blades and lifted head just showing what a wonderful time he was having. Conducting the storm? Oh, God's the storm orb, Azurea moaned, palming her face as rain dribbled down her body and through her mane. He's controlling it all. She watched him point and flourish and laugh as he commanded wind and rain and lightning. No wonder he'd paid out his nose for that magical thing. He was literally controlling the massive and violent storm. She stomped up behind him, drenched with rain and suddenly pissed off. "What on Tiamat's tits do you think you're doing?" she roared at him, sending a strong gust of wind up under his wings. They flapped open with their own weight, catching his attention. "Careful on what God's bosom you swear, my little cloud snapper." His head swiveled jubilantly. The look on his molten orange eyes was just scary. They were wide, happy, active with raw potential power. He was at the very height of his egomania, and from the cliff was lording himself over the region. "Look, look! The rabbit folk scurry for higher ground." He pointed to the village that was some distance away from his lair. Azurea squinted into the distance. Sure enough, there were rabbit folk running about, packing carts and saving children and moving beasts of burden. It was a full-on flood panic, and they were making to leave. "This storm orb is amazing," he roared, spreading his wings and splitting the sky with lightning as he roared. "I love it!" She head-butted him stubbornly, trying to see the artifact and get it from him. "You're destroying lives! Stop this!" "It's my territory. I do as I please," he grunted at her, holding steady against her head-butting. "If you flood everything out, there will be no hunting or any meat for us to catch." She pressed hard against him, trying to reach his undercarriage so he could snatch the orb away from him. He was palming it strongly under himself, and she could sense its magical aura with her supernatural sense of smell. The blue dragoness saw a dull yellow glow under the great red dragon, for the artifact itself was actively bringing torrential rain down everywhere, and was giving off massive energies to do so. Searanox snarled stubbornly, bumping his naturally armored muzzle against her a few times to shunt her away. "Oh, shove off, you great crabby thing," he sneered angrily, his wings opening and refolding as rains continued to pour out. The rivers were flooding over. "With this storm orb I am like a god." He threw his head back and laughed, his teeth out and his tongue free. "You'll be a god of nothing if you drown everything within a 10-mile radius," Azurea shouted over his unbelievable ego. "All the rabbit folk will leave, their crops will fail, the wildlife moves on. This place will be a washed-out bog and perfect for green and black dragons," she said desperately as torrents of water were rushing in over the fronts of the land. "What? Not in my territory." The mere mention of the greens and the blacks brought Searanox's self-adoring power rush to a screeching halt. He clutched the storm orb stubbornly, and halted the lightning, the wind, and turned the rain down to a normal level. "What do you mean by that?" he demanded. "Oh, greens love swampy, flooded areas." Azurea had caught his interest by the nose, and ran with it immediately. "If you destroyed this place by water, it would smell nasty and the decomposition would be awful. The waters would stand and become a breeding ground for horrible things, which a black dragon would love to set up residence around." "No, no, no." He thrummed his feet angrily. "None of that. No greens, no blacks. My territory." He looked out over the grand expanse of the forest and farmland, seeing the village far below. "They are not going anywhere." He put on a concentrating face, and the muddy yellow light faded from the storm orb. The rain turned off like a faucet, much to Azurea's astonishment. The scrambling rabbit folk below were stopped in shock, peering around as the waters literally receded before their very eyes. "This will not be a stinking swampland." Grabbing up his new toy like a hatchling, Searanox spread his wings and took to the skies, towards the lair. Azurea flopped down on the cliff's edge, sopping wet and relieved. All it had taken was a little logic to bring him down off his egotistical high. He'd wanted power over the weather for some reason, but was just abusing it. "Behemoth, forgive me," she mumbled, thinking of the Tiamat-Titi comment from earlier. It was not usually wise to speak of the god of evil dragons, for invoking her name could draw her gaze upon you, or so the story went. For a long time she watched the rabbit folk mill about in confusion in their village. "Perhaps they will think it was a freak storm, or a brief something," she mumbled, cocking her head and watching over them like a guardian angel. While she did see the rabbit folk as both food and an exploitable resource, she did not want to see them leave their homes like that. No residence meant no caravans, which meant nothing for dragons to snatch up and eat or covet in their hoards. That and, well, no one deserved to be driven from their homes like that. Azurea sighed, rising and shaking water off of herself until her mane lay down normally again. After a long time she sighed. Searanox would be very upset about all this, for he'd spent good money on getting that wretched thing. Now that he could not use it how he pleased, he would be in a foul mood for days. Rolling her eyes, she opened her wings and flew to the lair. It did not take long to find him, for Searanox was in the main hoard room, staring at the storm orb with a frown. He didn't seem to know what to do with it now. Sure, it was fun to play with lightning, cause floods and general mayhem, but if it drove away every living thing and invited green and black dragons into his region, then it was not something to be used. He couldn't sell it back to the architect. But he looked up with a snarl when Azurea came in. "What?" he said tersely. "You made the right decision," she said gently, folding her wings about herself as she sat on her haunches. "I just bought it," he growled. "You cared enough to preserve the rabbit village and their crops," she offered mildly. "To keep green and black dragons out of my territory," he snarled. "I don't care about any of them. I am heartless." He snapped at her savagely, his tail lashing behind himself and sending a wave of gold and gems against the wall. "Call it what you want," Azurea said. "They were getting ready to leave until you turned the rain off. Now they're staying." She tossed her shoulders in a bit of a shrug, turning her head to one side with her eyes closed. "Perhaps you are not so heartless, Searanox." That sentence was a mistake. He growled at her in a low, dangerous way, his wings half opening. He rose onto all fours, and all of Azurea's inner alarms started going off. She sidled around him, still speaking. "I just think you should consider it. You are the lord of this region, there is no doubt, but while you kill and eat and take what you want, you still preserve the region so it stays beautiful and healthy." She started walking backward down her own tunnel. He glared at her openly, rolling the storm orb to one side as he glared from under his eyebrows. He needed an outlet for his anger and frustration, and she was right there. Backing away at an even pace, not running, she kept talking. "Perhaps you can raise a farm or caravan that comes through to remind them who's boss when things dry up." He started walking quickly toward her, bad intentions in his eyes. Azurea sensed this and fled openly. He thundered after her, digging his claws into the stone. "Come back here, my little mistress," he roared, blasts of smoke and hot steam after her as they tore around the corner and past room after room of delicate treasures. Azurea folded her wings hard, using her pure momentum to run along the wall like a blue gecko. Using her claws, she leapt forward and around another corner as the furious and frustrated Searanox chased her, all his fangs out. The blue dragoness whimpered and lashed around a corner. Her sanctuary was right there. Searanox roared and dove for her. Azurea slipped like a thrashing eel into her sanctuary and pulled the rope, cutting herself off from view as the sanctuary spell sparkled behind her. She spent the next hour or so curled up in a corner, weeping, trying not to listen to Searanox roar himself hoarse with threats and fire upon the spell that kept her safe. This was what happened when one took a new toy from a great red, it seemed. Or rather, what happened when one showed him that perhaps he did have cares for certain things. He was not comfortable with the idea at all, and it would be at least a day before Azurea felt safe emerging from her sanctuary again. Things had been tense and quiet since the day of the storm orb. Searanox had not spoken to Azurea at all. He'd been busy watching for any potential draconic rivals, as though a green or a black dragon would suddenly pop into existence nearby, and he might have to pounce and rip its head off. It made him edgy for the next few days while the land tried to absorb the waters that had abused it for a while. Rivers were swollen, soggy crops were culled, and irrigation systems rerouted to drink in the excess waters while they could. Searanox had let Azurea do her own hunting, and had only been taking wildlife for food lately. It was better for the rabbit folk in the village nearby, he knew, if they could take stock of their things and their own beasts for a while. If they did not flourish, neither would his horde via the caravans that often came through. It was a trading town as he understood it, but because of the crossroads-like location, the items that came through were often of great value. He did not care for the rabbit folk. He was heartless after all, but their things were shiny, and he liked that. The Great Red knew Azurea would not rise for several hours in the early morn, so he decided to visit a more secret area of his mountain-carved lair. Going past Azurea's room and into the deeper tunnels, he went down, down, down until he came to a dead end. It was covered with carving marks, for that had been where he had stopped digging, supposedly. Speaking a command word, he waited patiently as the portion of wall cracked and slid slowly to one side. Checking over his shoulder, he slithered inside with his belly pressed to the stone beneath his carriage. The ceiling was low, for the room was smaller and less cavernous. Before him was an altar, surrounded by dozens and dozens of swords, morning stars, bows, and other conventional weaponry. All of them were stolen from would-be dragon slayers, and knights that came to challenge Searanox the Feared. Well, not stolen. You can't steal from the dead, he thought with a light chuckle. Upon the altar was a golden velvet sheet that covered the perfectly flat slab. Upon the slab was a great glass urn. The contents sparkled idly. "Someone new has moved into the lair," he told the urn of golden dust. "She is stubborn and mean, and rather intelligent sometimes, mostly crabby." The great red opened his wings only slightly, then refolded them for comfort. "She lifted her tail for me, though, hee. That was funny," he amended cruelly, his jowls lifting to show grand fangs in his dark smile. He flexed his tail blades a few times, trying to think of more to say. "It is less complicated, being heartless, you know. It's all instinct, which is the way things should be," he told the urn. The pressure he felt around his eyes told him that if he were not heartless, he would be weeping. He looked up at the wall behind the urn, where the portrait of a large golden dragoness was hung. She was beautiful, an eastern dragon of long body, lying out over many dunes of gold and gems with a coy smile. Her mane was liquid sunlight, and her eyes piercing starlight. The large red dragon had both paid and promised not to eat the artist because it had turned out so well. Searanox felt a tightness in his chest, but could not identify the feeling. It was not heartache, but rather what heartache would feel like if one had no heart. A sort of clenching sensation, a clenching upon a void. He growled uncomfortably, turning about when he was done speaking. Retreating back through the sliding portion of the wall, he closed off the chamber with another command word. Heading back to the hoard room, he found Azurea's back end sticking out of the... That was the music room. Mischief rising in his eyes, he flicked a claw out and scratched at her undercarriage. "Maip!" The blue dragoness shrieked and bashed herself against the ceiling of the archway. She fell, swearing so fluently that Searanox briefly questioned her being raised in the blue dragon courts. "What? What is it?" she said, rubbing one of her inner thighs with a hot glare. "What are you doing in the music room?" Searanox said, chuckling. He laid on his belly and put his chin in a palm, as though it were going to be a very interesting story. "I can play harp. Do you mind?" she snapped at him once her tail tuft had finally gone back to normal from its frizzed-out state. The rush of movement her tail could do was like a cracking whip. The great red leaned, craning his long neck to see she was tugging perhaps the biggest and most expensive object in the music room with her front paws. A solid silver harp, complete with perfect strings and doused in an anti-dust spell. She was tugging the heavy thing along the ground, which made a horrible screeching sound and was no doubt damaging the bass. He sighed and rolled his eyes. "One side, you clumsy thing," he growled, shouldering her aside rudely. Heaving and using his superior strength, Searanox lifted it off the ground with both of his front paws. Azurea gaped at him for a moment, but said nothing. The harp was dragon-sized, there was no doubt, but this made it very, very heavy. "Lead on," he said with a grunt. She turned about with an odd expression that was somewhere between annoyed and happy. Searanox was sure she would want the silly thing in her room, but she led him to a corner of the hoard room instead. "Be sure that's where you want it. I'll not be moving it twice," he said rudely, using his tail as a balance beam as he carefully set it upright on the ground. Azurea even moved the gold gems aside so he could set it directly on the floor. When it was settled, she returned the finery so that the floor could no longer be seen, and the harp looked as though it had been planted like a sapling. "Thanks," she said shortly, not looking at him. Azurea wouldn't waste manners on someone who had none, and the tension since the day of the storm orb had done nothing of their friendship? No, that wasn't the word. Nothing for their odd standings with each other. Searanox shrugged with a chest-rumbling growl, stalking past her. You play harp, Not what I expected from a crabby thing like you. He jabbed at her as he settled on a dune of gold and gems halfway across the room. Yes, I do. Azurea was turning it gingerly, plucking at a string now and then and turning the tighteners back and forth. When at last the things were in place, she plopped herself down next to it, sitting on her haunches. Why do you keep instruments if you can't play them? She asked him. Not everything in this world that is of value shimmers like gold, he shrugged. It was an ironic statement, for the harp was made of solid silver. Searanox rolled his eyes at the look she gave him for his response. Azurea looked at the craftsmanship of the harp once more closely. The base was made to look like clouds, and a worm-like eastern dragon made one of the frame bars look absolutely stunning. It was just as much a piece of artwork as it was a musical instrument. Too bad it was sitting in the lair of a dragon who could not even play the thing. The blue dragoness stroked it reverently, looking at it with a softened expression. Well, Searanox said after a few moments. Well, what? She barked at him in mild annoyance, snapping out of it. Are you going to play or no? He prodded at her, his tail blade slowly tumping over a dune of gold and gems behind him. We dragged it all the way out here after all. I suppose, she said in a strained way, like a question. Truth be told, she could not wait to try out the gorgeous thing, but with Searanox's comments and presence, it would be hard to enjoy it to its fullest. Sighing and running her hands rather erotically over the whole instrument, she finally pulled her hands out. It was beautiful. Azurea's expression melted, and her eyes closed as her muzzle fell partway open, into a face that most dragons only made during mating. Her eyebrows scrunched together, and the twin tips of her tongue poked out of her mouth only lightly as her ears tucked. Searanox cocked his head, blinking at the strange, happy face. Of course he knew no musicians, but he had heard stories of the truly reverent ones that got real pleasure of their instruments. Finally, he began to listen. You've been through many days alone, it's hard, I know it's true. Come forth, my little soldier boy, I'll sing a song for you. Searanox's expression visibly softened, and Azurea's mane stood a little on end. It took only moments for her to realize that the harp was magical in nature. Just the first 2 lines of her song had exuded a soft wave of some sort of spell into the entire hoard room. Given the size and scale of the instrument, whatever effects it had would be massive. But what were they? The blue dragoness decided to find out, but say nothing to Searanox. Marching on past heaven's gate, to what ends we don't know. By horse's head towards the end, to our next chapter we go. You've been through many days alone, it's hard, I know it's true. Come forth, my little soldier boy, I'll sing a song for you. Searanox had not pegged Azurea as the singing sort, but now that she had a harp in her paws, it was hard for him to believe he hadn't seen it before. Her graceful motion sent light shudders through its massive scaly frame. He sprawled out on his belly and lay his head on the chest of a dune of golden coins to hide his shivers. The finery pressed to his undercarriage like so many bits of sand, massaging him. His wings opened, refolded, and then settled as he watched her. Deep into the earth we go, when sunlight's gone away. For our past, for our dead, we kneel to Hamut and pray. While our lives go on in stride, we know those left behind will watch our wings and shine our scales as claws to foe do grind. You've been through many days alone. It's hard, I know it's true. Come forth, my little soldier boy, I'll sing a song for you. Searanox grew uncomfortably relaxed. He was not thinking hard on the lyrics, only that the voice pleased him, only that the music lulled him. He drooped visibly while she performed for him. Azurea watched the great red out of the corner of her eye as she strummed lightly on the harp. As the chorus of la la las went by, little piping sounds that held the tune, she saw that he was either very depressed or about to fall asleep. Her brow lowered in anger, and she was about to stop and shout at him, until his frame rose high, then fell low again. A sigh? It was an odd thing to see from Searanox the Feared. Then she studied the harp with her magical senses. It was resonating with the entire room, sending a soft and heavy blanket of magic over the air. The great red was right in the middle of it.
Ach, you great red demon beast!
A loud and obnoxious voice made Azurea's paws jerk and the song crashed to a halt.
I'll run you through and hang your scaly hide up like a great tent.
The blue dragoness's brow went up in both bewilderment and amusement, for a lone knight had emerged into the horde room. It was a rabbit folk, by the ears sticking out of his helm and the cotton tail sticking out of the back. Searanox's pleased and lazy expression dropped in moments, enough to make Azurea wince. The red dragon rose slowly, deliberately, a heavy motion that shook the floor of the cave. He raised his body to all fours at last, like a living mountain. Who dares come to the lair of Searanox the Feared while I am in concert? Azurea felt a twinge of heat on her cheeks at the praiseful word concert. Searanox opened his midnight wings and roared, the concussive force rattling everything in the room. Azurea tucked her ears, the dragon fear vibrating the air about her. Clenching her teeth, she fought it off, a single hiss puffing out of her mouth as though she'd been briefly burned. The knight held up a shining shield to block the raw, steaming heat that came from the red's mouth. Dragon fear poured off of Searanox's body, but the stubborn warrior steeled himself.
Wah!
The knight roared back at Searanox rather unimpressively, then threw something at him. Whatever it was, it broke like glass and spat at Searanox's chest with what looked like water.
Eat holy water, demon spawn!
He shouted triumphantly. Both dragons blanched, and there was a long silence. Holy water? Really? You're either touched in the head, or you did not do your research properly. Searanox picked a bit of glass from his chest and scales here and there. Dragons are not demons. There was a familiar clicking sound somewhere in the red dragon's larynx, and Azurea's tail curled. But we do like fire. A jet of flame scorched a straight line, engulfed the knight, and reduced him to cinders in mere moments. There was silence, until he turned and used his tail to knock down the pile of armor that remained. The pieces scattered noisily, and Searanox the Feared threw out his chest and roared his victory. The lair will smell like burnt fur for days, Azurea grumbled, shaking her head with a wry grin. A knight throwing holy water on a dragon. That was one she'd never heard before. She would need to remember it, for one couldn't make up stories that ridiculous. Searanox rolled his eyes, picking up the pieces and taking them outside. He sprinkled the armor bits and shield amongst the other wreckage that made his little ash garden outside interesting. Keeping the sword, he brought it back inside as a trophy. Better. He flicked his tongue at her. She nodded with a smirk, glad that they at least agreed the stench of burnt rabbit folk would not be agreeable for the main horde room. "You've got glass bits on you." Azurea came and stood sideways next to him. Searanox looked down, but his great head couldn't move far enough down to see it on his long neck. He struggled a bit, and she gave a snort of laughter. He cast an annoyed look over her, and she smiled apologetically. Using her tail tuft, she brushed at him, like a barber might at the back of someone's neck. Glass bits tinkled away messily. "Holy water? Honestly," she snorted, and he returned her grin. "You didn't even stay wet. Look!" Azurea let out a shriek as a massive section of his chest scales came away. "Bahamut preserve us," she gasped, staring at it and scuttling backward on all fours as her back arched like a startled animal. Her eyes slowly trailed downwards, from the neck to Searanox's chest. A massive portion of his chest was missing, simply missing, a great, heart-shaped piece. She stared at him in open, horrified shock. He frowned at her as her paw came out and slowly stroked the edges. It was a hole big enough to fit her fist into, yet he seemed perfectly healthy. The thick guard scales had just been hiding the big hole in his body. You... She quivered a little as she pulled back a little nauseated. "Really are heartless," he finished for her with a low growl, leaning down and getting the patch of scales. The moment of amusement was over. He struggled with it a little, then an audible clicking sound told him that it was in place again. Azurea sat on her haunches, hard. Hearts were not in fact heart-shaped, but she had thought it had been a figure of speech. This dragon was literally missing a great chunk of his body, and if that meant anything, it really did mean that he had no heart. "How are you alive?" she shrieked at him. "The architect helped me do it," he said, simply, shrugging now that he looked normal again. He took up the sword, his trophy from the night. Stay here for a bit. I have a special place for trophies, and I don't want you snooping." She did not move, but rather just stared at him in shock. He shrugged once more, turning about and going down the proper tunnel. Searanox came to the hidden room once more, at the bottom of the mountain lair. Checking over his shoulder that Azurea had not followed, he spoke the secret command word to open the way. He tried to ignore the clenching around the void in his chest, and frowned as he set the sword amongst the others. The altar room with the urn in it would never have enough Dragon Slayer's weapons on it, in his eyes. Azurea did not need to see it. Act 1, Part 5. Nightmares. "Your mating to our daughter is neither approved nor blessed," the great coiled golden dragon scolded Searanox openly in court. The great red had appeared after his soon-to-be mate had been spirited away by her kin. Red dragons neither need permission nor blessings. We take what mates we want upon their singular approval, Searanox said defiantly, the blades of his tail scraping loudly upon the perfect marble floor. The nearby servants winced, covering their ears. The female next to the first speaker said, "She dishonors our family finding company with the likes of you, Searanox of the Red Flame." The twin whiskers on either side of her muzzle made her look male to the great red, but he said nothing of it. Searanox stood in the grand room of an aristocratic family of golden dragons. Opening and refolding his wings, he watched his servants slither to and fro on his peripheral vision. Eastern dragons crawled on their bellies like great snakes in his opinion, with stubby legs that seemed to have little meaning to them, though his mate-to-be glided along like she was in water. That was the one thing he loved about her. The great sweeping columns held up a grand, palace-like structure with a nice big stained glass skylight. The entire lair was built on a mountain rather than in it, so the building was made to resemble a holy temple of some sort. Stupid gods and their high and mighty stylized cultures. You stole her from my lair while I was away. You will give her back, or risk hostilities between our houses. Searanox tried to speak their court-heavy language, curls of white smoke rising from his nostrils. Politics and other such garbage would hold attention more than direct threats against this sort. The much bigger and more powerful golden couple chuckled melodically over their whiskered noses. We have nothing to fear from you, Red Dragon, much less your family. Do not threaten us with an ununified force of loners. The male spoke once more with the liquid golden smugness that Searanox had come to hate in the breed. He knew groups of red dragons did not live together, and only briefly gathered upon the birth of hatchlings. That aside, she is no longer give-able.
What have you done with her?
Searanox reared up a bit, growling threateningly and sending the lesser golds skittering away like the maned worms they were.
I demand you.
We tied her with bonds and dropped her into the nearest rabbit folk castle. A merciful death for dishonoring our traditions and family laws. The female great gold dragon slithered about, then upright so that she was coiled about like a massive rope. Searanox gasped, his pupils shrinking into slits of shock.
You killed her?
He said, gasped and quivering in the wingtips. His heart felt like liquid ice, and his long neck bowed in agony. He hyperventilated, claws pressing hard into the floor and teeth clenching. We have many other children. Our line will continue. The male coiled up much like his mate, much like a snake, much like a filthy, slimy snake whose head needed to be crushed. Searanox growled, snarled, and gagged with each difficult breath. His back wing shuddered halfway open, and he uttered a cry, a great, heartbroken cry that would bleed the hearts of even the most jaded dragon. Stay your animal tongue, Red Dragon. The male golden dragon flicked his tongue idly. We will not fear your savagery in our own house. Sure enough, guards were coming, armed with spears and armor to, at the very least, see Searanox away.
Fear me?
Searanox's white mane fell over his eyes, and his bowed neck sent a terrible shadow over his face.
You will fear me, he whispered.
What? The female of the house had not heard him.
You will fear me.
His head tossed back, and he looked into the skylight above him. The guards narrowed their circle around him as he glanced to all the great columns. You will all fear me. His voice rose, and a quiet clicking in his throat signaled the activation of his inner kin. The guards closed ranks to protect the heads of the household from searing flame.
You will all fear me.
He reared up, and with two quick and savage breaths broke the main columns holding up the high ceilings with blasts of fire. It took a few moments for anyone to realize what was happening, and one moment after that the other columns buckled under the weight of the massive, fancy dragon house. The columns were much more for show than for function, inadequate for their burden. You fool! The roof! The male golden dragon started desperately uncoiling to make for the exit when, very suddenly, the roof came down as one massive, pressing force of death. The skylight shattered, and every single dragon in the house of the golden dragons died, crushed to death. Black wings rose slowly, spattered with glass.
A head arched out of the wreckage, until Searanox rose in the ruins as the rest of the house came down room after room. He heard the cries of the dying, and he continued to glare wordlessly at nothing until, finally, things went quiet. Slowly, moaning in agony, the head of the female head of the house pressed free with her muzzle. She quivered, body broken in who knew how many ways. Shuddering in agony, the one good eye she still had looked upon Searanox of the red flame with pain and hate. She could barely choke out syllables, spurting blood from even her mouth as the rest of her head slowly emerged from the wreckage. Searanox had been standing directly under the massive skylight, and as such had survived the crushing weight of the fallen building. He looked down when he felt a stickiness under his paws. It was like liquid gold, dragon's blood, golden dragon's blood. It flowed and pooled all around him, his silvery claws stained golden. Then black as other organ juices flooded over his feet. He looked over at her with a molten gaze, his eyes liquid oranges and reds. She twitched as he came close, leaning to put his lips to her bent ear. "Your mate was wrong. Your line will end with you," he whispered to her like a lover. She moaned a soft sound, still squirming and trying futilely to free herself from the wreckage of her home. She gagged blood from her maw, and it dribbled down her chin to the pavement. Great Red watched her with a quivering, hissing expression of boiling anger, the same sort of pressure that makes the body quiver when one's teeth are clenched too hard held him. He seized her by the horn, forced her to the pavement, and struck her. She did not have the lung capacity to cry out very much. Holding her down, he struck her again, and again, and again. The breakings of the bones in her face did not faze him. He would not relent. Even after she stopped moving, he struck and struck her again. Golden blood flooded over his talons and feet until he gave the dead dragon's head a harsh shove away from himself. Searanox took a great breath and rode a horrible, wrenching cry to the entire mountain range. "You will all fear me! You will all fear me! You will all fear me!"
Yes, but let's do the fearing after breakfast, shall we? Azurea was thumping Searanox repeatedly in the side, which grunted him awake. He looked around quickly, bleary. When he realized he had been dreaming, he groaned and laid down again. No. Get up, you lazy thing. The blue dragoness prodded him with the brunt of her muzzle, right in the softer spots of his neck. You talk loud enough in your sleep to wake me, now you're gonna get up too. Groaning, Searanox got up with a toss of his many horns, shaking doggishly. He stretched, surveying his claws and tail and wings. Everything looked fine. The pale feeling of his dream slowly slipped away from him, and he cocked his head at her. "I am not your servant, you know. You can hunt on your own terms. I only manage to catch what wildlife is foolish enough to wander into a clearing. You've yet to show me the real places to eat, like farmsteads or something." Azurea complained to him. "No time like the present? Come." She turned about, foofing his face with the tuft of her tail in a teasing way. He growled and nipped at her, but followed grumpily. Disturbing a dragon from sleep in general was a bad idea, but after such a dream he was sure to be in a sour mood all day, and he knew it. Which was why he smiled grandly when he spotted over a dozen rabbit-folk knights assembled outside his lair. Azurea smirked a little, looking over at him. A certain hatchling-like sort of glee washed over him, and soon his nightmare was forgotten. "If you'll wait here," Searanox said in a gentle, dragonly way, the sound of drawing swords signaling that his tail blades had sprung open.
Searanox the Feared, we've come to...
Searanox's great bladed tail came down on the speaker and split him from head to crotch, along with his horse.
The spray of blood and gore was magnificent.
Less talking, more dying,
Searanox snarled, the anger of his dream rushing back to him. The knights scattered, then stubbornly came into a practiced formation. They leapt off their horses, drawing weapons. A couple of the smarter ones slapped their horses' butts, sending them running away from the battlefield. Searanox loomed over them, blotting out the sun with his black wings and sheer size. With a group-sized shout they rushed upon him. With a sweep of his tail he scattered them like matchsticks, leaping upon the first and tearing his head off with his teeth, cocking his head as arrows battered his horns instead of his eyes. He sent up a strong wind to knock down an archer. A swordsman went for his tail, and got a fireball to the face for his trouble.
Get him! Get him! Go for the face where his scales are thinnest.
They betrayed their plans like children, which helped the Great Red to angle his head away from projectiles. A spear and spinning throwing axe clattered off his crown of horns, and he returned with a powerful slash of his foreclaws. Azurea watched the Great Red dance among his enemies, and snatched one knight for herself when opportunity presented himself. She coiled her tail about him and hung him upside down, bonking his head comically onto the ground several times. She giggled, knowing that even a small contribution would help. A fantastic spray of blood accompanied Searanox's roar as he knocked the top half of a knight off his legs. The sheer force of the blow made the corpse explode when it slammed into a tree on the other side of the clearing.
Such fragile creatures!
The red dragon laughed, exhilaration in his tone.
Not one of you trained to fight something my size. Insulting.
He brought a close fist down upon another knight, knocking him into the earth up to his waist and shattering his skull. The battle raged for less than a minute, until none remained but Searanox, Azurea, and Azurea's plaything knight. She looked around at the sheer brutality, a little shocked that he hadn't toyed with them like he had with the singular knight from the other day. "You've missed one," Azurea said, uncoiling her tail and throwing the knight to Searanox's feet. The armoured rabbit-folk knight fell to his knees, quivering and looking at all the blood and gore that cupped the ashy veil.
Run. Run and tell them all you know of what you saw here today.
Searanox the Feared snatched the knight's weapon out of its sheath, pushing him away with a massive palm. He scrambled and ran for his life on foot, completely forgetting his horse. There was silence, blood and gore dripping from Searanox's teeth, claws, and tail.
There, a dozen or so horses. Breakfast is served.
He snarled deep down in his chest. Azurea chuckled, nodding a bit. After killing a horse or two and figuring out how to work the saddles off, the two dragons feasted. The great red dragon fidgeted a bit, then coughed up an empty helm, gagging on the hard metal edges. Azurea actually laughed, shoving his shoulder a little. "You know, Searanox, I'm surprised you have no mate," Azurea said with a little bit of friendly affection for him. "You're such fun when you're killing things and making a huge mess." The void in Searanox's chest clenched at nothing, and he growled at her, saying nothing as he chewed on horse meat. "Well, fine, be that way." She flicked her pronged tongue at him, leaping and crushing the next horse to death with her weight. The great red spirits lifted a little, for that was exactly how he killed the sky dragon in front of her in the past. Dragging the horse back to where Searanox lay on his belly eating, Azurea sat on her haunches next to him. She watched him out of the corner of her eye, chewing carefully so she didn't swallow any bones that were too big for her. "Grrr," she said, showing him many bloody teeth and horsemeat bits in her jaws. Such a prissy little grrr. He snorted at her, but his eyes betrayed pain. Azurea glided along the thermals, high in the sky. She was scanning the landscape. A flight around Searanox's wide territory took perhaps a day when flying a complete circle at top speed, but she wanted to see what some of the lands held. Sure, the mortal races called it a certain country or another, but dragons hardly had time to learn the names of countries that came and went when they had lifespans of several hundred years. She smirked a little, admiring the wide river and the rising cliffs, Most of the zone was temperate forest, an occasional hamlet or town, and the rest was farm. There might have been one city, but she didn't care to search every corner of the territory to find it. She would have to ask Searanox for a map later. Deciding it best to wash before the sun went down, Azurea flew in wide circles down towards the deeper part of a big river. Hovering above the surface, she folded her wings and plunged beautifully in. The cool water felt good. The summertime was so hot and muggy sometimes, but deep water was always much cooler. She emerged with an arched neck, looking like a legendary Loch Ness monster, paddling along idly. Her mane wetted down, she looked like a seaweed monster, giggling as she folded her wings and used her tail as a rudder. She almost didn't notice when she crashed right into a tiny little raft. The passengers squealed, almost thrown off their tiny craft.
He's a monster!
One of them said, as Azurea swiveled her great head around to peer at them. 3 little rabbit-folk children, on a raft made of tied-together wooden logs. She blinked at them, for they'd run aground on her side in wingtips.
Whack it with a ruler!
The biggest of the 3 said. They scrambled as a group to pull a long branch out of the water, which took all 3 of them to lift. Flump. Azurea cocked her head and tried very, very hard not to smile. But she did, and all her fangs rushed to display. They all paled to varying shades of grey and white.
She's gonna eat us!
The only female of the 3 went to the farthest corner of the raft and quivered, which was honestly perhaps 5 feet across.
Don't eat us, Blue Sky!
She whimpered, waving a tiny paw at her as though to ward her away. Blue Sky? Azurea tasted the name, for that was a dragon title. Blue dragons had an aristocracy, and thusly did not have a titled system like some of the other dragons. She'd never had a title before, and it puzzled her. You must have the wrong dragon.
Nuh-uh! You're Azurea of the Blue Sky!
The bravest of the 3 was also the smallest. He stood, trying to heft the branch and hit Azurea once again, but it was simply too large for him, so he stood there clutching it.
My dad says Searanox the Feared has a blue dragon as a mate. That's you.
He pointed at her muzzle so closely her eyes crossed. Azurea of the Blue Sky. She tested it out. It did have a sort of ring to it. She cocked her head to the children, wondering how word about her had spread among the mortal races nearby. Then she remembered that Searanox had a habit of letting one in every group of attackers go, to tell the horrific tale. One of them must have seen her and heard the name, and decided she was his mate. Where the title had come from, there was no telling.
Can you really turn invisible when you fly in the sky? 'Cause you're so blue?
The rabbit-folk child asked her. He was obviously too young to understand dragon fear yet, so it would not affect him. He was innocent.
My dad says you can make tornadoes with your wings. Can you really?
He was leaning off the end of the raft, his eyes wide and shining with the brightness of curious children. Yes, Azurea said to humor him. Yes, I can. She lifted her wings above the waters and gave them a light flap. The resulting strong wind caught in the raft's bedsheet sail, and the 3 children shrieked as they were tugged along. Go on now. The blue dragoness watched them twist and turn downstream, desperately trying to get their rudder back in place.
You're steering it wrong. I am not. It's a branch. Give me that.
Azurea watched them shriek and squabble until they had gone downstream and out of sight. Azurea of the Blue Sky, she said aloud, mumbling it to herself. Proper blue dragons didn't need silly titles like that. What was she? A great red? Even in the courts. She stopped a moment, tilting her head. Her rebellious nature boiled up inside her, frothing as she thought about the aristocracy she had abandoned for a much rougher and more draconic life. Azurea of the Blue Sky. She smiled wider and wider, until all of her marvelous teeth were on display. She lifted both wings and lifted off violently, causing a heavy suction whirlpool that lasted for several moments. She spread her wings wide, droplets of water raining off her like bits of the sun as she went into the sky. A vague rainbow followed her across the sky as she made a wide and exhilarated arc across it. Misted bits of water slipped from her mane until she was finally dry, and she began the journey back to Searanox's lair. Azurea lay in wait, smiling great dripping fangs at her incoming prey. Having found a portion of the road that came very close to the woods, it had made a perfect stakeout spot. Careful calculation had told her that the local trade caravans would be coming through on this day. She'd watched the village for a long, long time, whittling at logs and other paws-on activities to busy herself. There was a mild panic, but the locals who spotted her saw that she never moved from the high cliffs towards their little town. Was this blue dragoness some sort of guardian? Did she watch over the village? Was she keeping Searanox the Feared at bay somehow? Rumours were rampant, but no one was brave enough to approach her, so she waited and watched without harassment. Finally it had paid off, which brought her to the current moment. Azurea leaned a little, checking her target. 2, 3, 4, 5 covered carts, all pulled by horses and mules, guided by unarmed and vulnerable village folk from the towns over. The market day was coming, and this would be a day of trading where much gold would change hands for all manner of products. She lay in wait for them to come close enough, just a few miles away from town, and out of sight from most geological angles. Suddenly she thundered into view on all fours, springing upright and flaring her wings wildly with a roar. A single flap of her gale-force wings toppled over half the carts, sending the pulling beast screaming and the people scrambling in confusion. A great blue beast leapt upon one of the upright carts, crushing it and all its contents into the ground, ripping the driver from the seat and throwing him like a rag doll into the forest. He hit a tree somewhere, never to be heard from again. Shrieking once more, feral and exhilarated, she almost didn't see the crossbow bolt that flew past her. So they were armed, just a little bit. Drawing her body up, her wings opened all the way and flapped cyclones of spinning air, lifting the final cart off the road and sending it careening into oblivion, beyond Azurea's sight. There was a great scrambling cry as the drivers and citizens fled before her. Azurea felt a great and rushing joy, a pure feeling of the positively draconic. It felt good. The rush, it felt so good. She toppled another cart upside down, spilling its contents onto the ground with her tail. Looking around, she saw that all of the owners had fled in terror. Making quick work of the horses, she skittered back with all the excitement of a hatchling to examine her loot. She found crates with cartoonish cow drawings on them, marked with red, bell-shaped plants she didn't recognize. Breaking one open with her tail, she found heavily spiced meat haunches inside. "Ooh," she said, leaning and sniffing deeply. She coughed and her eyes watered, so she set those aside. She'd been planning this for weeks. She wouldn't ruin the day eating something bad for her. Growling some, she pawed through the next cart and found a very nice little cache. It jingled when she shook it, no doubt coinage for buying things on the market days. "Mine," she chuckled, setting it aside too. The next cart was pottery. No, pottery with wine bottles inside. Grinning wider and wider, she pulled everything valuable from the caravan that she wanted. Looking at her pile, she soon began puzzling over how to move it all. She was not massive, able to carry entire carts like Searanox was. She was built for speed and maneuvering. Sighing and not wanting to abandon her pile of loot, she sat on her haunches with her brow furrowed in thought. Her gaze strayed to the pile of heavily spiced meats. She smiled. "Searanox!" Azurea leaned into the hoard room innocently. The great red looked up, slowly, from a great dragon-sized tome with a troubled expression. She never used that tone when speaking to him. He unfolded, then refolded his wings. What?" he said carefully, closing his book and pushing it under a mound of gold. Azurea made a mental note of its location. Suspicious, he rose to all fours with a curl of his tail, making sure the blades were in view. "I need a favor," she said, voice dripping with innocent want. "What?" he said, tilting his head and leaning away some. She told him of the smashed caravan and how she'd basically left all of her loot out in the open in a big pile. She tossed a haunch of spiced meat at him, which made his neck arch a little with interest. The quickest way to a male's heart, no pun intended for Searanox the Feared, was through his stomach. "There's a whole shipment of that at the wreckage," she offered coolly, eyes narrowing with amusement as his inner kiln clicked on and he shot flame over it all. When it bubbled, hissed, and steamed, the smell was mouth-watering to him. Searanox plucked it up and scarfed it down, the spices kissing his tongue. He licked his chops, blinking, then licked his chops again. "A whole shipment," she offered again, hoping that the connection between the fire dragon and hot food was more than just a silly thought. He smiled suddenly, broadly, and nodded. "Lead the way, my little cloud snapper. I will fetch your little hoard for more of this." The deal was simple and easily struck. Azurea swiftly led him away. It took perhaps an hour to reach the site of the blue dragoness's victory, but she gasped aloud when she found other dragons there. "The hell!" she roared, circling and diving quickly. They were poking about the scene, pointing at footprints and examining broken bits of this and that. They ducked instinctively, turning with more alarm when Searanox the Feared dropped out of the sky. Blue sky dragons. More blue sky dragons to add to the tally, Searanox knew. They wouldn't dare trespass upon his territory unless... "Searanox the Feared!" The leader stepped forth, upright and regal as they addressed the reigning dragon of the region. "We've come to..." Azurea's tail had wrapped around his neck and jolted him down with a gagging sound, sending the other three into a frenzy to grab and force her down. She scrambled, scratched and clawed like a wild animal, which made Searanox's brow raise in mild approval. Something was different today. His head wheeled over to look at the massive wreckage of the caravan. It was all turned over, destroyed and ruffled through. The promised hoard and crates of spiced meats were nearby. "Oh," Searanox chuckled darkly, suddenly. "Hoard lust." Azurea had come under a sudden and brutal version of the mental rush of possession. All dragons love to hoard in some form or another, but if she'd never had her own hoard before, and she was already an adult, this would be an adrenaline rush like no other. The Great Red watched one of the blue dragons stagger to one side, clutching his bleeding eyes in agony. Searanox grabbed him by the mane and slammed him face first into the ground. Whether dead or knocked out, it mattered not. The angry hurricane that was Azurea of the blue sky was still thrashing, biting, snarling, roaring through the small group of blues that had no doubt come to claim her from Searanox. "Honestly, how many of your kind must I kill before you stay away?" he asked the limp body, watching his little cloud snapper rip the unholy guts out of anything within claw's reach. There was a clenching on the void of his chest, and Searanox gasped aloud, gritting his teeth. His neck arched forward a little and he winced. He panted just once, then quickly shook his head and the feeling passed. Odd. By sheer number of limbs, eventually Azurea was grabbed up and pinned down. She wriggled and squirmed like an angry oiled snake, catching another of her attackers in the eyeballs with her claws. He roared, clutching his face and reeling in agony, dark blood spurting in all directions. Finally, one of them had her by the horns and forced her, chin first, to the ground. "She's gone feral! Sick in the head!" one of them shouted as they struggled to hold her down effectively. "Look at her body," another said, grunting with effort as they tried to control her. "She's all skinny and lithe. He's starving her." The truth was that Azurea had slicked down to mostly muscle by this point, and though she appeared smaller, she weighed more and was much stronger. They looked up at Searanox, as though finally remembering he was there. "Don't even try it, fire breather. We've come prepared. One of them held up his front forepaw, which had a thick band of red-colored metal around one of his digits.
"Oh, rings of fire resistance," Searanox said, arching his eyebrow. "Am I that much trouble to you now? Finally killed enough of you to warrant preparing for?"
He watched carefully as they tried to force a thick metal collar onto Azurea's neck. She roared, snarled, and bit anything that came near her snout. "Hold her still, damn it!" one of them complained, bleeding from his paw now. With one of them dead, one half blind, and all of them covered with scratches, they were not faring well. The dragoness spat blood, shrieking at them ferally. Knowing he was bound by his deal with Azurea, Searanox finally stepped forth, his inner kiln flicking on. All three blues reacted in unison, thrusting their open palms out at him. Just as the flames erupted from the great red's mouth, their rings began to glow and throb with protective magic. Vaguely egg-shaped shielding formed around them, invisible in every way, save that the fire could not penetrate it.
"Those are high quality."
Searanox smirked a little as they went right back to work trying to bind Azurea. She snagged one of them by his wingtip, ripping the leathery bits with her claws. Her eyes were anger, her claws vengeance. She would not be held down and bound like this.
"I suppose I can't get to you now,
"That's right. We got them especially for you, Searanox the Feared." The red's title was spat out with great disrespect, which made the blades of his tail flick open.
"Too bad for you it doesn't stop my tail. Or her."
With a powerful turning motion, Searanox used the momentum from all his weight to expertly hack the front paws right off one of Azurea's attackers. The loss of pressure freed her just enough, and she flared up like an angry vorpal snake. Teeth flashing, she tore the throat out of another assailant, tail slapping the remaining one, then diving back onto his face with all her claws out. He died. Blood flooded in all directions as they settled, lifeless to the ground. Searanox took careful steps backwards, not wanting the blue and squirrely wrath of Azurea on his own face.
"Thank you very much."
He watched her survey her enemies, throw her chest out and roar to the heavens that she was the victor. Pure, unfiltered, draconic glory. Beautiful. "Oh gods! So alive!" Azurea panted, her mane disheveled and her muzzle covered with gore. Sweat pattered off her. "So alive!" She began to laugh, a mad, shrieking laugh. One she'd always wanted to laugh. "I'm so free!" she shouted, flopping over and getting a great swath of blood onto her for her emotions. She surveyed the 4 dead sky dragons, lying around like a battlefield had claimed them all. "I'm not your object to give away!" she shouted at the corpses. "I am Azurea of the blue sky!" She leapt onto one of the dead bodies, clawing at it viciously. Blood was spattering, going everywhere. She was blood-drunk and horde-lusting at the same time. Searanox shivered. Pleasurably? He had to admit it was attractive. Shaking his head, he cleared his throat. She turned to look at him with intense eyes, seeing he was breaking open the boxes of spiced meats and breathing flame upon them. Azurea rushed to the scene like a pig to a trough, eating with gusto and trying to breathe at the same time. She was eager, lustful, happy, and volatile. The spices no longer drove her back.
"Now you know,"
He watched her with a dark smile,
"what it is to truly live as dragons were meant to, my little cloud snapper."
He watched her tear viciously at the meat haunches like an animal, gulping it down without chewing until she felt better. Suddenly she froze, head lifting. Her eyes watered. "Water!" She rushed away and into the foliage, where the nearest stream lay. Searanox blinked after her, and heard the splashing sound somewhere in the woods. It seemed like the storm had passed, so to speak. Snorting and shaking his head, he went to loot the corpses. 4 rings of greater fire resistance. The greater brand were very, very hard to come by. The great red chuckled, opening his black wings. He could only imagine how much gold was dropped for these 4 rings. Searanox himself was very fireproof, but one never knew when such things might be needed. Shrugging, he hid all 4 in the empty space in his chest, behind his false scales. That would be his true payment for moving Azurea's horde to their lair. As though on cue from his thoughts, Azurea emerged from the thicket of the woods. She looked exhausted, soaking wet, and dragging a bit. "I feel better," she said after huffing water out of her nose.
"Do you now?"
Searanox grinned swords at her, sitting on his haunches.
"What shall we do with them,
He gestured vaguely to the 4 dead dragons that were lying on and around the wreckage of the caravan. The blue dragoness surveyed the giant mess they'd made, then finally shrugged. "Let them rot." She turned her nose up at the whole scene, going and getting the coin cache she'd found earlier. "You took their rings, so why don't you help bring my horde back as payment?" she said over her shoulder. Searanox jolted a little, then watched her lazily fly away. He found a light smile on his face as he shook his head.
"Azurea of the blue sky."
He trailed off, frowning. All of the carts were in many pieces. How was he going to get all of these items back to the lair? Act 1, Part 6. History. And if anything comes that you cannot handle, the command word is written here. Searanox pushed a scroll into Azurea's grasp that would activate the defenses of the horde room itself. What they were, he did not say, but they were for an emergency. The Great Red was going out for the day, some semblance of patrolling his territory. You know, burn a barn here, snatch a cow there, little things to remind the locals that Searanox the Feared was among them still. "I can take care of myself, thank you, and I still have my sanctuary room." Azurea flicked her tongue out at him indignantly. Rolling her eyes, she turned from him and went down the appropriate tunnel towards her private space. Searanox folded and refolded his wings as he watched her go. Shrugging, he turned to leave. Exactly 5 minutes after the Great Red had gone, Azurea bounded, dog-like, out of the tunnel again and began fiercely digging about. Coins, gems, and trinkets flew this way and that. She'd seen Searanox reading the other day, and it had turned into a burning itch the last few days, wanting to know what. She'd seen him hide said book from her when she'd come to ask for his help moving her loot from the caravan. He was a ball of draconic arrogance. Who would have thought he had a culturally enlightened brain too? No heart to speak of, but a brain nonetheless. Snickering, she stopped suddenly when she found its corners. Rubbing the coins and trinkets off it with both paws, she lifted it out and tilted it. Finery sprinkled off it, revealing the thickly bound cover. No title, no markings, just a thick cover with golden filigree. Checking the tunnel Searanox had left through, she giggled conspiratorially to herself, setting it on her belly. Flipping it open, she read the first line, written in loopy draconic.
"I am getting mated soon to the dragoness I love."
She deadpanned. The hell is this? Azurea checked the date at the top of the page, carefully written. 3434 of the Second Age. That was 50 years ago, she mumbled, brow furrowing in confusion. 50 years was not an outrageous stretch of a time to a dragon's lifespan, but was still half a century. Preserved so well, the book still looked brand new. Swallowing a little, she leaned carefully over the text. "I think it's a good idea to chronicle this next chapter of my life, so that I may look back upon it and laugh in my later years. Or perhaps give it to my hatchlings should I die suddenly, so they will know their sire. My name is Searanox of the Red Flame. My mate-to-be is called Estiori, a beautiful gold from the eastern lands. She is of an aristocratic lineage, but I do not care. She is mine now, and I hers." Azurea slammed the book shut, her heart thundering. This raised so many questions so quickly that it was painful. Searanox would more than likely murder her if he caught her reading such a private thing. what basically amounted to a diary. What was the male version? Journal? Cocking her head, she stared at the golden cover of the tome and scratched nervously behind her ear. Easing it open again with her claws, she flipped a few pages to read more. Estiori has agreed to elope with me and live outside her silly aristocratic society. She is unhappy there, and I do not blame her. Politics and negotiation are not what dragons are for. We are for burning, ruling, dominating, and showing the mortal races that we are superior. One does not argue that a unicorn is not beautiful. Any dragon that does not think we are superior and should rule over the races is only kidding himself. These new Eastern families are becoming feminized, and it only makes reds like me ill. At least I was able to save one of them, and love her as my mate. Azurea ran her claws through her mane a few times. This was a side of Searanox she had never fathomed. She knew the heartless, arrogant, hungry red dragon for the beast he was, Searanox the Feared. Yet, this was written by Searanox of the Red Flame. They were the same dragon, yes, but what had happened to make him this way? It dawned on Azurea that this book would probably tell her everything, and her heart thundered in her throat. She gulped, panted once, knowing that the great red would be gone for hours and hours and she would be able to consume the entire thing with speed reading. He would never know. She turned a few more pages, eyes wide. The next entries were written in ashy, rusted-looking color that was doubtlessly blood. Estiori is dead. Her family wanted so badly to restore their so-called honor after their daughter had run away with a red dragon that they murdered her. They dropped her, bound, into a stronghold of mortals, where she was hacked to pieces. When I went to look for her, her family told me such. I killed them all, and destroyed their lair. Then I went to the castle that my beloved was dropped from the sky into, and destroyed that too. I destroyed the surrounding towns, and all the inhabitants. I used their blood to write on these pages. Azurea's paw leapt to her mouth. Searanox had slaughtered several towns? A whole family of golden dragons? Destroyed a mortal stronghold? It conjured horrible images to her mind, but she could not look away. She had to know more. All the answers were here. She had to know, no matter how ugly the truth was, or how bad it became. The next page was a list, with severe-looking check marks next to each of them. Eastern House of Gold, destroyed. Western House of Gold, destroyed. Northern House of Gold, destroyed. Southern House of Gold, destroyed. Central House of Gold, destroyed. Only the 5th house mounted any sort of defense against me. By then they were cowering in their homes. Gold dragons do not dwell in caves or tunnels, but rather build castles like the mortal races do. Pathetic. The place was warded against my fires by magical towers and a handful of guards, but it did not keep me from dropping great rocks and whole trees upon their defenses, then burning it all to the ground. I have changed my title, for I have seen the fear in their eyes. I am Searanox the Feared, now. I have united all 5 of this region's golden dragon territories, and claimed it all for myself, roughly 500 square miles. More will come, perhaps for vengeance. I will kill them too, and scatter their bones upon my yard. Azurea gasped again, trying not to be ill. How many had he slaughtered? How many homes and peoples had been destroyed? All for his own revenge? He had simply tracked down everyone from his dead beloved's family and slaughtered them all. What about the hatchlings? Had he killed hatchlings too? Her breath suddenly caught in her throat, and she looked around very, very fearfully. Searanox's hoard. It was no wonder it was so unbelievably massive and varied, much less filled with things like musical instruments and scrolls. They were not his treasures, All of it had come from the various houses of the Golden Dragon families in the region. It was blood money, all of it, all for his vengeance at the loss of his beloved. The blue dragoness slammed the book shut, covering her face with both paws. She just tried to breathe and not weep or be ill. She was Azurea of the blue sky. She was made of tougher stuff. Heaving a great breath, she forced herself to flip the book open once more and keep going. Turning a few more pages, she found a bizarre sketch of a scarab with a jeweled back, tilting her head.
Everyone who has crossed me is dead. All the houses of gold in the surrounding region are rubble, their hoards added to my own. I have set up residence inside a great mountain, and have honeycombed it out to many rooms and tunnels. This took months upon months, and each night I collapse, exhausted, hoping some half-cocked dragon slayer will come to finish me. But for naught. My reputation has spanned great distances, and Searanox the Feared is too overwhelming to challenge directly. I have met a strange creature called the Architect. With her help, using a greater magic than I thought I could control, I tried to revive Estiori, but no such luck. I exhausted over half of my powers, half of my very being into the spell, but it could not be done, not even with her vast powers. So now I am reduced to half of my glory, mateless and alone. I cremated the body on a proper pyre, all the more ironic that her ashes were golden. I have stored them in a hidden place in my mountain home.
He tried to resurrect her, Azurea mumbled, turning a few more pages. There was a fold-out drawing of the mountain, covered with command words and general knowledge of the inner workings of Searanox's lair. One would think this tome would be under some sort of ward or protection. The blue dragoness found herself whispering, but if he has been poring through it in the past few days, perhaps he has been leaving it out so he doesn't have to keep fetching it. Her eyes suddenly darted to a room on the map that held a strange symbol upon it. It was a curling, golden, Ouroboros shape, a snake dragon eating its own tail. She frowned, touching it with a claw. "Where is this?" she whispered, the tufted end of her tail whipping about a little as she puzzled over it. She found the music room on the map, and then traced about the area until she found her own room, then several other rooms she knew. Every room was labeled except for that one. "That's a dead end." Azurea pored over the map, trying to memorize the command words and inner workings of the mountain itself for several hours. Each place had hidden little items, magic enchantments and other things, hidden passages wormed about here and there, which led to Behemoth knew where. All the secrets of Searanox's lair were right here before her. Her eyes kept returning to the golden stamped Ouroboros symbol in one of the hidden rooms. Carefully closing the tome, she rose and replaced it where she had found it, covering and mounding it carefully with a mix of gold and gems. She started down a tunnel. Azurea soon passed her own room, the music room, and a few other places of note as she found the place where she thought was a dead end, where Searanox had simply stopped digging. There was even a claw marks upon the wall to make it look that way. She leaned in, inspecting it closely with narrowed eyes. She spotted a tiny, golden filigree symbol near the bottom left of the sheer wall, an Ouroboros. Licking her dry lips a little, she fell to all fours and folded her wings tightly. Estiori? It came out like a question. The symbol flickered with an inner light, its magic running cracks up and down the wall before her. She stepped back, afraid it might fall on her head. Instead, the cracks worked in a very specific pattern until the wall cracked right down the middle and slid apart like double doors. Torches flared to life, accented with the glassware and prisms. Anything to spread the light in this room and make it more grand. Azurea leaned inside, eyes wide and ears turned back. It was beautiful. Gold. Gold everywhere, all over the walls and across the floor. It was a small room that she had to enter on all fours. There were rabbit folk weapons mounted all over the walls, any sort she might think of. Then her gaze fell upon the altar. On it sat a large glass urn, filled to the brim with sparkling golden dust. Ashes. Estiori, the blue dragon breathed, folding her wings tight against her body as she looked at the portrait mounted on the wall behind the urn and altar. She was beautiful, even for an eastern dragon with a long serpent body. Coiled about like a great golden snake, she gazed from her painting with erotic, piercing, golden eyes that had made Azurea shiver. So this was the dragoness that Searanox had once loved. She stood there, dumbfounded, not knowing what to do. She dared not disturb any of the weapons that lay strewn about the room. They were no doubt meant as offerings, for the rabbit folk had been the ones to kill her directly. Turning her head to take in the beautiful madness, she swallowed, feeling overwhelmed. This changed everything. Searanox was not some arrogant, vicious, heartless animal. He was a heartbroken soul who had literally removed his heart to stop hurting. Azurea's gaze fell upon the filigree in the middle of the altar and spotted a familiar symbol, no doubt from the maker of the little shrine and altar, a golden scarab with a jeweled back. She knows, Azurea whispered, lowering her head in sudden understanding. She knows how this all happened. Azurea looked around the hoard room, her tiny sanctuary, a small pile of gold in the corner, several cases of wine from the caravan, a bed of fresh straw, and other odds and ends. Searanox had helped her move what she'd obtained from the caravan to just outside her room. Then she carried it all through the protected threshold, and had spent a few hours arranging it, all just so. It was shaping up, if only slightly, but she wanted more. The aching happiness of starting and building up her own hoard was a wonderful feeling. She yearned for the day when her own hoard would carpet the floor with gold and gems like his did, which made her shiver happily. But no matter for the moment. It was midday, and Searanox had gone out hunting. Now was as good a time as any. She slithered out of her sanctuary, out of the tunnel and into the main hoard room. Extending her wings, she expanded her magical sensitivity. Closing her eyes, she turned her head one way, then the other. Sniffing just a little, she began to see points of light on her eyelids. Each thing in Searanox's hoard that gave off a tiny glow was magical in nature. Most of it was sheer gold and finery, so it wasn't too overwhelming. Walking slowly around with her eyes closed, she nosed at a mound of gold here, a pile of gems there. She thumped a locked chest open with her muzzle, searching slowly and carefully. Then she found it. The blue dragoness frowned, closing her wings and opening her eyes when at last she set her claws upon it. Nestled among millions of other coins was one unlike the others. It was larger, and while still gold, it was marked differently. On one side was a scarab with a jeweled back, and on the other it was merely painted jet black. Scratched roughly into the coin's backside was the word Tecton. Raised aristocratically, Azurea didn't take long to flick through her language lessons to decode what it meant. Builder, she said with a flat tone, almost rolling her eyes at it. She had seen the architect give the large coin to Searanox when he'd purchased the storm orb some time ago, claiming that he could contact her again. This coin was obviously the way to do it. Spiriting off to her sanctuary, she closed the curtain beyond the threshold of the spell that protected her from any and all intruders. Making sure the room was well lit, she peered at the object closely. There was probably a command word or something. Most of the magical things Searanox owned worked either on command words or by sheer force of will while touching them. Frowning, the dragoness unfolded and refolded her wings a few times, trying to think on what to say. She looked around the tiny room, at her tiny hoard, and the sanctuary spell once more. Making sure the curtain was closed and sticking her head out into a hallway to make sure Searanox was not back yet, she nodded to herself. Deciding that what was basically amounted to a business card could not be so cryptic, she performed the obvious. Putting the coin over her massive thumb, she flicked it at the wall. "Tecton!" she exclaimed as the metal rang like a tiny bell. It struck the far wall and burst into golden sparks. She recoiled a little, and gasped as a golden portal opened on the wall. Azurea waited, but no one appeared. Frowning, she looked down and cocked her head, leaning forward some. When the portal yielded neither magical presence nor any golden armored figures, she huffed a little. "Am I supposed to go through myself?" she said, sounding unsure. The whirling, twisting, golden magic looked unstable and chaotic inside. Who knew where she might end up if she was to step through? Squaring her shoulders and huffing loudly, she set her jaw and slowly walked forward. She closed her eyes so it would not blind her, stepping carefully on all fours out of her protected sanctuary and into the portal.
I thought I might
see
see you again, Azurea of the blue sky.
It was a voice both male and female, but mostly female.
I have not seen a female dragon in the lair of the heart of Searanox in decades.
A shining golden figure stood upon... Azurea's eyes wandered. It looked like a massive temple pyramid, covered with hieroglyphs and odd designs. Everything shone gold, gold everywhere. She squinted, peering around. It was above ground, but it could not have been anywhere on the planet that she had ever heard of. She'd stepped into another dimension. Multiple moons wandered across the sky, and the very grass in the nearby fields gave off a metallic sheen. It looked like the entire place was smelted from gold, and then brought to life. The blue dragoness was half blinded, the light being too much for having emerged from a cave just then. "Architect?" Azurea said, squinting around.
Pardon a moment.
The sheen of, well, the world, turned itself down a bit until it was bearable.
You have great fortitude to have not only stolen something from a fellow dragon, but stepped into another plane of existence ill-prepared.
The small, slender armored figure folded her arms under the curve of her breast, green eyes narrowing in the slits of her helm. Azurea suddenly saw what an incredibly bad idea this had all been. Searanox would notice the missing coin when he returned, and would be asking questions. And here she was on a different plane altogether. "I've come to speak with you," she finally blurted.
Gold moves my hand, nothing else.
You
saw me but once some months ago. You should know this.
The architect's magical aura worked across her outline, highlighted her armor into a brightness that made Azurea's eyes screw up and shed tears of pain. "I have brought you gold," Azurea defended, extending the membrane of her wing over her brow. "Please, the light," she pleaded. Turning, with a little hidden pouch under her wing, she spilled perhaps 200 gold pieces onto the ground. The armored figure approached with a quick pace, forcing the dragoness to retreat slightly, panicked. The light faded to a more bearable level. "You are amusing, dragoness. I can see why heartless Searanox keeps you." She turned, heading towards the stairs of the temple. Leaning, she made a come-along motion with one finger over her shoulder. The small pile of coins that Azurea had brought leapt into the air, formed a lumpy sphere, then rocketed off to who knew where. Gulping a little, the blue dragoness folded her wings tightly and approached. The architect wheeled about to look at her, making her jolt to a stop.
"Speak then, Azurea of the blue sky."
The architect folded her arms, once more powerful and regal. "Searanox was not always heartless," Azurea said, trying to bolster her voice with the determination of stated fact. "You made him that way." Yes, the architect said, nodding once with a flash of green in the slits of her helm. "Why? How?" Azurea arched her neck, swan-like, trying to look down at the small figure. But no matter how big she made herself, she could not
look down upon such a creature.
I doubt you could comprehend moving the beating heart of a dragon, and letting him still live,
the architect said with some sort of patient parent in the tone.
I think the why matters more to you, but you already know the why if you are here to speak to me.
It was not a question, it was a statement. Azurea swallowed, refolding her wings. Searanox gave up half of his powers to resurrect his mate, and when he failed you helped him remove his heart. So that he would not hurt any more? The architect nodded once more as she spoke. He's devoid of the ability to care for anything or anyone, then? The architect's eyes frowned at her.
The heart is gone, and heartless Searanox is more instinctive now,
she said.
Go on.
She cocked her head to hear what else Azurea had figured out. I read his records. She was frowning down at the armored figure. He slaughtered her family, conquered surrounding lands, and took them over for himself.
Why are you here,
Azurea
of the blue sky?
The architect jabbed in very suddenly. Azurea's wings rippled a little. Why did you do it? You made him into an animal. She paused a moment, and as the architect made to answer, she interrupted. And don't say gold moves my hand. There's a limit to what you should do when it comes to your craft, no matter how limitless it might be. The eyes of the architect flashed dangerously, and Azurea fell silent in her accusations.
What someone can do,
and
what someone should do,
are two different things.
Azurea of the blue sky,
the architect said in a low humming voice that sounded like many, many voices all at once.
Heartless Searanox had made choices he could have made, should have made, and all of them made him what he is today.
Half a dragon. Azurea angrily frowned down at the yellow demigod. You handicapped him, body and soul.
I gave him what he asked for, and took payment for it.
You tore out his heart, and it warped him into something he's not, Azurea shouted, suddenly defensive. How could you? He was hurting, not dying. In a sudden burst of passion, she snatched the little figure into her paw and squeezed hard. The architect did not squirm, or even cry out. The armor dug into Azurea's paw, unbending.
You fancy him, don't you?
An aura of light forced Azurea's paw open, and the architect was suddenly in a spherical ball of sparkling magic.
You want to see who he is when he can actually care about something other than himself.
Azurea staggered back, falling backward with a crash as a concussive wave of magic struck her front. She tumbled, end over end, and back through the very portal she'd come through. Back in her sanctuary, she struck the wall with some force as an agitated architect followed her out into her own world. The pressing, crushing force of magic smothered the poor dragoness against the wall, and she cried out for mercy. "Please," she cried out, "no more." She tried to flap her wings, send up a twister, do anything to fight back, but it was too overwhelming. The incomprehensible majesty that was the architect was too much for her. Searanox's fear and respect was suddenly justified. The architect was suddenly at her side, face by face, leaning over her.
Heartless Searanox happily gave up half of his powers and his very heart to soothe his own agony. If you want to restore him to what he once was, beat him at his own game.
Azurea squirmed, tail lashing about like a snake that was being strangled. The magic held her, pressed down on her, crushed at her with unending weight. Then with a great crack of magic, the architect vanished, as did the portal. A large coin tinkled across the floor, gold on one side and black on the other. It spun, then settled while Azurea lay there panting. It was only moments later the exhausted dragoness remembered that in the game room, one of the two castles that could be captured for victory had a heart-shaped design on its tiny doors. No one ever beat Searanox at his own game. What better place to hide his heart? Act 1, Part 7. Heart. Searanox lounged easily into the bottom of the waterfall lagoon. The summer was growing humid, and although he was a creature born of fire, it was always healthy to have an occasional dunk. Extending his wings into the falling water, he let it all beat down on him, shaking doggishly and washing out his mane. Though cleanliness was not anywhere near his top priority, he had been neglecting it lately. Azurea did provide plenty of distraction from the usual bore and drawl. There was a clenching in the void of his chest, which made him gasp and arch forward violently. He stepped quickly from the cool waterfall, holding his breast as though he were having a heart attack. But that would be silly, for he had no heart. Nonetheless, his body painfully clenched on the empty space that was in his chest. He settled on the shallow river bed so that only his head and neck were above the surface. The cool waters steadied him, and after a time the clenching sensation stopped. He took a deep breath, then drank deeply from the river to soothe himself.
There he is, looky.
3 children rolled out into the open from the foliage of the woods. Searanox blanched at them. They were either stupid or touched in the head to approach him so openly.
Searanox the Feared.
The only female of the trio said, her eyes huge and worshipful. One of her long ears folded in the breeze, and she had to push it out of her eyes.
Wow, look at him.
Said the elder male.
He's huge,
said the younger male. Searanox mused at them, wondering if it would be worth interrupting his bath to rise from the river and turn them into smoked rabbit steaks. He had just started grooming, so getting gore all over himself would have been counterproductive. Besides, there were probably only 1 or 2 bites of meat among the 3 of them. Instead, he elected to snarl savagely and growl at the group, who cowered before him in a quivering mass of fur and huge ears.
"Why do you disturb Searanox the Feared, little rabbit-folk children?"
he said, rather annoyed they'd just waltzed up to him like he wasn't a colossal fire dragon of some renown.
We just wanted to say hello,
the female braved forth, holding out a long branch that was spattered with red berries, like he might lean forward and pluck them with his tongue.
We meted your mate on the river some time ago, Azurea of the blue sky.
Searanox eyed the rather literal olive branch they were extending, and flicked it with sparks from his nostrils. It burst into flames, and they retreated back, away from the sandbar and among the rocks that would not burn. Searanox's brow furrowed. So that was where her title had come from. She'd not come up with it herself. Sky dragons did not carry titles as the great reds did, but the rabbit folk didn't know that, and had assigned her one.
"Away from me, insects,"
he growled at them, nostrils rising with black smoke and mild annoyance.
"Lest I burn and eat you up."
The hum of dragon fear spiked in the air around them. It was an empty threat, hardly worth the effort, but it did make them scramble and retreat as his black wings unfolded. When they were gone from his field of vision, he returned to the waterfall. Sticking his head under and pressing it into the hidden cave beyond, he turned about, laid his body into it, and let his head and shoulders stick out of the waterfall itself. It massaged him and helped wonderfully with his mane. It was perhaps half an hour before he heard an additional voice. He rolled his eyes and snarled. If it was more children, he would just kill them on principle. If he didn't eat a few people now and then, they would forget who he was and why he was called the Feared. Could a dragon not bathe in peace in his own territory without being disturbed? He drew himself up, folding into the cave behind the waterfall. His molten gaze pierced the moving waters as he glared out into the world to see who was coming. It was a knight on horseback, wielding a lance and shield. A glitter of magic ran over this shield, and Searanox could see the rune of Resist Flame written rather poorly across its face. Bad quality, but functional. The great red's lip curled, agitated. Had those children told him about his washing spot? The horse stopped at the river's edge, and the knight peered about, his vision settling on the waterfall. The twin pricks of molten light gave away the cave's presence, as well as the occupant. He set his lance aside slowly, switching to a throwing spear. The red dragon growled aloud, enough to be heard over the waterfall itself. How insulting! This knight coming after him with a sharpened stick? Pah! A lightning storm was on the horizon, colouring the sky dark. Azurea had taken every advantage while Searanox was out, doing whatever he was doing. Going straight to the game room when the coast was clear, she spoke the command word to open the door and activate the torches. "Game room!" she called aloud. Her stomach jolted hard and the sentient presence of the game room washed over her, enveloping her mind in the cobweb-tea tendrils of its magic. I'm here to find the heart of Searanox," she said. "Where is it?" Classified. Azurea cocked her head in shock, looking around. She hadn't heard a voice, nor a mental sound to her mind. It had simply formed the words there, and made her think them. Was she crazy? From all the excitement and stress of unraveling this mystery? Scampering across the room, she ran her eyes over the rows and rows of little toy soldiers. The pads of her fingers touched carefully painted wizards, archers, catapults, and other implements. The game pieces wiggled to life, shaking their various weapons at her. They were no threat, but all the varied motion confused her eyes. Shaking her head quickly, she moved on to the larger constructions. Where were the buildings? She would have bet the tuft on the end of her tail that Searanox's heart was within the castle marked with the heart shape on its double doors. To win the game, she only had to destroy or capture the opponent's castle, a fitting metaphor. Rearing up and putting her claws on the stone alcove shelves, she squinted back and forth at all the little game boards, structures, towers, model forests. There was so much to inspect. Growling in frustration, she rolled her eyes at the simplicity of the solution. Game room. She came down on all fours. New game. The room hummed, shuddered, then sprang to life. Azurea was very careful to fold her wings and not move. Boards, game pieces, structures, and tiny things rushed back and forth through the air. Tiny forests clicked and locked into place, with tiny hills and little tiny hamlets that made up a massive board for the strange war game that Searanox so coveted. Difficulty? One more word formed inside Azurea's mind with no presence or sound to it. There was only one dragon in the room, so she would be playing against the room itself. "I want the heart of Searanox," she said firmly, watching the two castles settle themselves on opposite sides of the board. Password phrasing accepted. Maximum difficulty allowed. Azurea watched her army color itself blue, and the opposite armor color itself grey. Grey for neutral? Grey for the room? Who knew? Turning without ceremony, she watched the game room make the first move as she pattered. Around the board itself. Reaching, she snatched the heart-marked castle right off the board and took off running. The doors began to spring shut as the room began to shudder, in protest of her cheating. Unfolding her wings, she flapped as hard as she could, rushing along the ground like a maddened gecko. The rush of air crashed the doors off their hinges, stone though they were, and she watched them shatter into millions of pieces on the tunnel wall opposite themselves. The game room gave a wordless moan of confusion, its rules broken and its defenses overridden. Azurea exploded out into the hallway as game pieces on the board milled about in a panic. Folding her wings, quickly the blue dragoness almost went down into a sanctuary. She looked at the model castle in her claws. If it was a part of Searanox, the sanctuary barrier might destroy it. Turning quickly, giddy and panicking now that she had her prize, she went quickly into a side room that was filled with mundane things like chests and rabbit folk-sized furniture. Looking about as though Searanox might pop in at any moment and accuse her of stealing, she turned the tiny castle over and over in her claws. Panting a little, she cocked her head, wondering what she should do with it now. She raised it slowly to her ear. Nothing. Peering at it closely, she eyed the intricate heart-shaped design on its tiny doors. There were no little knobs to grab hold of, or any visible way of opening it. Was it like a puzzle box? She shook it a little. Searanox grunted in pain, his eyes widening. He held his chest, mouth agape in sudden stabbing pain. This was not a strange chest ache. This was pain, sudden, angry pain. The heart, he whispered suddenly, eyes widening in realization. That's what I've been feeling all this time. He emerged suddenly from the waterfall to leave, startling the knight and panicking his steed. The knight threw his spear straight and true into the dragon's guard scales, straight in the center of his chest. It sank in easily, halfway in its length, and through the false scales in Searanox's chest. His heart would have been there, but no, that's where the hole in his chest was. With the side of his dragonhood challenged, the Great Red was no longer in a rush to leave. There was a knight that needed killing first. His eyes narrowed in annoyance. "Oh, the pain," he growled, plucking it out and crushing the spear into splinters in his draconic grip. The knight took up his lance and raised his shield, ready for a fight to the death. Sudden, roiling pain shot through Searanox's breast. He roared in agony, clutching his chest with both paws. He reared with a great and feral cry, falling backward as a white-hot torture stabbed at his chest. His back arched and his muscles spasmed uncontrollably. It was not the spear that had hurt him. It was... The knight charged forward on his steed, eager to finish off the Red Terror while he was down.
Yeah!
He roared a battle cry while his long ears flapped in the wind, levelling his lance for where his spear had injured the beast. Azurea felt a little bad, for she'd broken the castle upon the ground. But the result was not what she expected. Inside was a massive, heart-shaped ruby. No, a blood ruby. She'd never fathomed a gem that size. It sparkled and shone with a bright inner light that pulsed very much like a heartbeat. Settling over it, she gingerly picked it up from the pieces of the model she'd shattered. Turning it over and over, she frowned. She hadn't exactly expected to find a bleeding organ, but a gem was unexpected as well. Tilting her head, she remembered that the hole in Searanox's chest was heart-shaped as well. Could it really be so easy? She held it up between two claws, conjuring an image of the great red brute in her mind. Holding the gem out, she tried to see if perhaps the gem could be placed in the hole in his chest. Like a slot on an enchanted weapon, gems often served as augmentation devices for magical armor or weaponry. Could this gem be the representation of Searanox's heart? If it rejoined with his body, would it become a flesh and blood organ again? It occurred to her, not for the first time, to wonder what pumped blood through his body if not a heart. But the architect had cryptically said she wouldn't understand. She closed her fist over it, heaving a great breath. Now she would just have to find a way to insert the gem into Searanox's breast without him stopping her. He wanted to be heartless. That was plain enough. But if he became whole again and could care, perhaps he would not take her head off? Azurea opened and refolded her wings, wondering very suddenly why she was doing this. She was a tenant in the cave of a red dragon. He shared food and shelter with her, and generally just traded barbs with her whenever they spoke. They made deals over the slightest thing, and he always told her the truth. Frowning, she suddenly realized that perhaps that was all she wanted in a friend, a companion. No veiled political angles, no ulterior motives, just a heart on his sleeve dragon with a massive ego to match. You fancy him, don't you? The words of the architect burned her own ego and colored her cheeks. She looked down at the gem in her claws.
She literally held a heart of another in her grasp, for it poured red light between her fingers. Would giving him his heart back neuter his personality? One that she'd grown fond of? There was hesitation, but only for a moment. Her ears suddenly perked when an echo roiled suddenly through the cave, a dragon's roar of agony. Searanox. Azurea followed the scent of blood, heavy on the storm-pregnant wind. Draconic blood carried a very distinctive scent to her, and set off her magical senses as well. Closing her eyes as she soared the skies, she locked her wings and extended her senses outwards. It did not take long to find Searanox, for he shone like a grand bonfire to her magical detections. Wheeling in the proper direction, she followed a river to a drop-off. There was a waterfall, and the blue dragoness gave a shriek of horror, for Searanox was turning the river red with his blood. A knight on horseback had plunged a huge lance into his chest, and it was gushing blood into the moving waters like a fountain. Her jowls lifted, exposing angry fangs. Her ears tucked and her eyes narrowed. Folding her wings, she descended from on high like a missile, shrieking ferally with her claws outstretched. The armored figure turned just in time, wrenching his lance out of Searanox and levelling it at her just as she descended upon him. She tried to pull up, but was not fast enough. With no time to aim, the knight clipped the membranes of her wings, tearing it. The blue dragoness screeched, crashing headlong into the river with a ground-shaking splash, wing bloodied. Screaming out in pain, she wheeled about with her whip of a tail, knocking the knight off his horse. The animal bolted, screaming in panic. The storm that had been gathering suddenly broke over them, sending down high winds and sheet rain. Azurea roared ferally, injured and furious. She flicked her eyes at the fallen red who was bleeding out in the river. Shuddering, with a sudden bursting fury, Azurea reared up with another roar for challenge. The knight's lance had shattered in the fall, so he drew his sword and raised his shield. They circled slowly while the rain plinked down on scale and armor.
Rah!
The knight charged at her head-on. Azurea's gaze flicked at Searanox, the horrible burning fury of her fallen friend filling her up. It boiled her blood, tingled her body. Then suddenly, all the pressure dropped away into a great black void deep in her belly. Click. Azurea knew that sound, and her eyes suddenly widened in shock. Searanox often made that sound when she lowered herself, digging her claws into the shallow of the riverbed that only came up to the knight's shins as he rushed at her. Grounding her weight, she aligned her spine as her wings opened, mane flapping wildly in the wind and sheet rain. Azurea's mouth opened to take a great breath, right as her opponent was upon her. Blue lightning exploded from her maw, blowing the dragon slayer apart where he stood. The river ignited in a molten light, drying up the waters and sending exploding sparks in all directions. Trees toppled over and fell far away from Azurea, and a massive wind rushed away from her in the concussive blast of split air. Thunder rocked her to the very core, then rushed into the ground that she held. Temporarily blinded, the blue dragoness shook her head as the buzz faded from her ears. The scorched helm clattered into the sandbar nearby, all that remained of her enemy. Gasping in exhilaration, she looked around at the destruction with a slowly growing smile. Lightning! She could breathe lightning! She'd grown strong enough to invoke a breath weapon. Throwing her chest out and flaring her wings, she roared a joyous victory sound that rolled through the forest like a rumbling wave of thunder. Coming down from her high after a few moments, she suddenly wheeled about. "Searanox!" She rushed to his side. His eyes, normally glowing bright yellow-orange, were dulling.
"Azurea?"
he said softly, bleeding out as he spoke. The waterfall was gone because of the massive heat rush from her lightning breath that shocked the river out of existence. This let his blood pool around him where he'd been lanced in the chest.
"I am dying. Hit a lung," he said, coughing blood. His eyes slowly slid closed and he began to go still. No, no, you're not, she said, pushing him onto his back with all her might. He rolled, shrieking a roar of agony as he laid upon his wings, and she ripped away the panel of fake scales from his chest. I've brought your heart! She pulled away the glowing gem from the folds of her scales under her wing. It glowed brightly in the falling torrential rain. Thrusting it upon his chest, she soaked her paws in his blood as she pressed firmly upon the heart-shaped hole in his chest. It hissed like a hot coal striking water, and Searanox cried out in mortal agony once more. Azurea pressed and pressed, praying that it would somehow restore him. Bright light poured between her fingers, and she prayed that placing it there was enough. If some complex ritual was involved, he was doomed. Blood began pooling up and around him, refusing to spread any further. Then, slowly, reversed itself. It flowed up into his scales like a backward waterfall. Shattered bits of scales began to force themselves together and click into place, like so many bits of armor. Searanox's outline began to glow a light red. The gem sank into his chest, flaring with all the light of the sun. Azurea shrank away as sparks of magic rushed over him like tiny bits of lightning, repairing flesh and blood and scale. Guard scales grew over his chest like plate mail, hiding the gem beneath it. The great red's eyes sprang open and he gasped aloud, squirming about and then righting himself to lay out on his belly. The blue dragoness backed up a bit, surveying him as his wings opened. Liquid night. He panted a bit. My chest, he complained, holding himself with wide eyes. Heavy. Searanox! Azurea was fighting joyful tears, though the rain would have hidden them. She stood there in the pounding rain as Searanox lay there, inspecting himself with the slow, growling confidence that a recovering hospital patient might. What will you do now? She asked, smiling softly as the tears did come.